In the summer of 1997, sitting in a limousine on the way to a Paris film premiere, Diana leaned across to her hairdresser and said something that was recorded on camera without either of them knowing it. She was talking about a man who had been dead for 10 years, a bodyguard, a police sergeant from Essex who had spent 2 years walking 3 paces behind her through the public occasions of her life, who had been removed from her protection detail in the summer of 1985 after the palace concluded that the relationship between him and the princess had become inappropriate, and who had died 9 months later in a motorcycle accident on a wet road in East London. She said she thought he was probably the greatest love of her life. The camera captured it. The footage was reviewed years later, examined frame by frame, and the words were legible on her lips in the way that words spoken without awareness of being filmed are sometimes legible to people who know how to look. She was not performing. She was telling her hairdresser, in the back of a car in Paris 2 months before her own death, what she actually thought. Barry Mannakee was 39 years old when he died. He had been married for 15 years and had 2 children. He had served with the Metropolitan Police for over a decade and had been assigned to the Royal Protection Detail in 1983, 2 years after Diana entered the family she was trying to survive. He had been assessed as a reliable, competent officer whose record gave no indication that his assignment to the Princess of Wales would produce anything other than the professional performance of a professional role. What it produced instead was the one thing that the palace's protection infrastructure was most specifically designed to prevent: a relationship between a royal principal and a member of her security detail whose character the palace found incompatible with the requirements of either the role or the institution. They removed him. The removal was swift, efficient, and conducted through the internal procedures of the Metropolitan Police's Royalty Protection Division in ways that produced no public record and required no public explanation. He went back to general duties. 9 months later, the motorcycle he was riding as a passenger struck a car that had pulled across its path in Stevenage, Essex. He was pronounced dead at the scene. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Diana was in Cannes at the time, attending a film festival. She was told privately. Her response to the news has been described by the people who were near her at the time in terms that go beyond the response to the death of a former colleague, in terms that suggest someone processing the death of a person whose significance in her life went deeper than the professional relationship that was the only publicly acknowledgeable dimension of what existed between them. The palace said nothing. The official record said nothing. The protection detail closed around what had happened and what had not happened and what would never be established with certainty, and the life and death of Barry Mannakee were absorbed into the institutional silence that the British establishment deploys around the things it needs to remain silent. For 10 years, it worked. Then Diana sat in a limousine in Paris and said what she actually thought. Barry Mannakee was born in 1947 in Essex, which is the kind of biographical detail that requires no particular significance to be attached to it beyond the simple fact of its ordinariness. Essex was not a place that produced royal bodyguards in any systematic way. It was a county of market towns and industrial suburbs and the eastern spread of London's working class into countryside that had been urbanizing since the war, and the people it produced were people whose ambitions and trajectories reflected the specific quality of that specific English world rather than any particular orientation toward the institutions of the British establishment. He joined the Metropolitan Police in the late 1960s, following the route that young men from backgrounds like his followed when they wanted a career that combined public service with a degree of authority and the specific quality of civic significance that police work provided in the period before the relationship between the police and the communities it served had been damaged by the sustained controversies of the 1980s. The police of the early 1970s was still an institution that commanded sufficient public respect to attract the kind of ambitious, competent, community-oriented young man that Mannakee appears to have been, and his decade of general policing before the assignment to royal protection built a record that was solid enough to produce the recommendation for consideration. Royal protection. the Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Department of the Metropolitan Police, which manages the personal security of the senior members of the royal family and of visiting dignitaries, is not an assignment that officers apply for in the ordinary sense. It is an assignment that the department identifies officers for through a selection process that assesses a specific combination of qualities whose combination is less common than any of the individual qualities taken separately. Physical competence matters, the ability to respond to a threat quickly and effectively, which requires the specific fitness and the specific tactical training that close protection work demands. But physical competence alone produces the wrong kind of officer for the specific environment that royal protection creates. The environment is the environment of intimate proximity to the people being protected, the daily presence within the personal space of individuals whose public lives are conducted at a level of visibility that makes every moment of interaction with them a moment that could become part of the public record. Officers who are physically competent but socially awkward are not suitable for this environment because the social awkwardness produces the specific kind of friction with the protected principle that makes the protection arrangement itself uncomfortable in ways that damage its effectiveness. The principal needs to be comfortable with the officer's presence. Comfort requires the officer to have the social fluency that makes their presence in the principal's intimate environment feel natural rather than intrusive. Mannakee had this fluency. The accounts of people who worked alongside him in the protection detail describe an officer whose social ease in the specific environment of royal protection distinguished him from colleagues whose competence was in other respects equivalent. He was warm without being inappropriate. He was attentive without being obsequious. He understood the specific social grammar of the environment he was working in, the way that a protection officer's presence should be felt rather than seen, the specific quality of alert attention that effective close protection requires and that effective social management requires to be conducted simultaneously. He was assigned to Diana's protection detail in 1983, 2 years after her marriage to Charles, and at a moment in her royal life when the specific difficulties of that life were beginning to be visible to the people close enough to observe them, even if those difficulties remained entirely invisible to the public, whose understanding of Diana at that point was shaped by the wedding and the fairy tale and the official presentation of a happy young princess in a happy royal marriage. The Diana that Barry Mannakee was assigned to protect in 1983 was not the fairy tale princess. She was 22 years old and had been inside an institution that she had not been prepared for and that had not prepared for her, and the institution's management of the gap between what it required and what she had brought to it had been conducted with the specific efficiency of a palace operation. The management was competent and it was thorough, and it left her with the experience of someone who was being managed rather than supported, whose needs were addressed in the ways that the institution's requirements permitted and not in the ways that her actual experience of those needs indicated were necessary. She needed warmth. She needed the specific quality of human attention that says, "I see you as a person rather than as a position," that receives what you show without the institutional assessment of whether the showing is appropriate, that makes the daily experience of being you feel sustainable rather than like a sustained performance whose demands never relent. The palace's formal apparatus could not provide this. The people who constituted the formal apparatus, the private secretaries, the ladies-in-waiting, the household staff, were people whose professional relationship to her was shaped by the institutional context in ways that limited the warmth available within the relationship to the warmth that the institutional context permitted. Mannakee was outside this limitation in a way that was unusual among the people in Diana's daily world. He was there for professional reasons, to protect her, to manage the security of her movements, to be present at the events and the engagements that her public schedule required. But the professional reasons placed him in a proximity to her daily life that the professional framework did not fully structure. A protection officer walks behind the principal. The walking behind means being present for everything, for the public occasions and for the spaces between them, for the arrivals and the departures and the transitions between one engagement and the next, for the moments when the performance of the public role is suspended between its required occasions and the person inhabiting the role is simply a person navigating the day. The person navigating the day was Diana. Mannakee was 3 paces behind. He saw what the day required of her and what it cost her. He saw it consistently, across the 2 years of his assignment, with the specific attentiveness of someone whose professional role required sustained observation of the person he was protecting. The observation produced knowledge of her that was intimate in the way that sustained daily observation of a person always produces intimate knowledge, not the knowledge of a friend, whose intimacy is produced by chosen mutual disclosure, but the knowledge of a witness, whose intimacy is produced by the sustained observation of someone going about their life without always being aware of being observed. Whether he disclosed to Diana that he had developed, through this observation, a knowledge of her that went beyond the professional relationship's requirements is something that the accounts of their interaction suggest rather than confirm directly. He responded to what he observed, which is what people do when the observation produces feeling. He was warm with her. He was attentive in ways that exceeded the professional minimum. He was present in the emotional sense rather than simply the physical sense that close protection requires. She noticed. This is the consistent element in every account of their relationship that has been produced by people who were near enough to observe it. That Diana noticed the specific quality of Mannakee's attention and responded to it with the specific quality of attention that people give to someone who is paying them the kind of attention they have been desperate for. She sought his company in the margins of the official occasions. She found reasons to be in proximity to him that the official schedule did not require. She communicated with him in the ways that people communicate when they are navigating the specific constraint of a relationship that the formal context limits and the emotional reality exceeds. The palace noticed too. The noticing produced the action that the palace's institutional logic required. The assessment that the relationship between a member of the princess's protection detail and the princess herself had developed a character incompatible with the professional requirements of close protection work, and the decision that the incompatibility required the officer's removal from the assignment. The assessment was not wrong. The removal was not disproportionate, given the institutional logic that required it. What the assessment did not capture, and what the institutional logic was not designed to address, was the specific situation that the removal produced for Diana, the removal from her daily life of the one person whose presence in that life had been providing the specific thing that the life's other provisions had not been providing. The one person who had simply seen her. His removal left the gap visible. The gap was the gap that Diana's subsequent relationships across the decade that followed the removal all reflect. The gap that the marriage had never filled, that the institution could not fill, that the people the institution provided could not fill, and that the specific quality of Mannakee's attention had temporarily made feel fillable. When he died 9 months after his removal, the gap was still there. It remained there, unfilled and permanent, for the remainder of her life. The limousine conversation in Paris was not simply a nostalgic reflection on a lost relationship. It was the expression of a woman who had understood, across 10 years of the gap's persistence, what the gap contained, and who was identifying, in the person whose removal had made the gap visible, the specific quality of attention she had needed, and that his death had made permanently unavailable. The greatest love of her life. The words were not hyperbole. They were the precise statement of a precise understanding of a specific loss. The marriage of Charles and Diana in July 1981 was, from the perspective of the British establishment, the most successful piece of public relations the monarchy had produced in a generation. 28 million people watched it on television in Britain, an estimated 750 million watched globally. The dress, the carriage, the cathedral, the kiss on the balcony. The images were absorbed into the collective consciousness of a watching world with the completeness that the fairy tale format was designed to produce, and they were absorbed in a way that required no interrogation of their accuracy because the format itself provided the emotional logic that made interrogation feel unnecessary. The marriage that the images represented was the marriage of a future king to a young aristocratic woman whose suitability had been assessed through the specific mechanisms that the palace used to assess such things: family background, personal character, the specific quality of public comportment that the role of Princess of Wales would require. Diana had passed the assessment. She was from the right family, she had the right manner in public, She was sufficiently unformed by strong independent opinions that the palace's formation of her into the role could proceed without the friction that a more developed personality might have produced. The palace's assessment was accurate in its measurement of the qualities it had set out to measure. The problem was the qualities it had not set out to measure, the qualities that the role of Princess of Wales would actually require Diana to draw on across the years of the marriage, and that the assessment had not identified as relevant, because the palace's understanding of what the role required was an understanding that had been formed across decades of performing the role in ways that assumed a specific kind of person would be performing it. The specific kind of person was someone who had been formed, before entering the royal family, in the specific combination of aristocratic expectation and emotional self-containment that the palace's social world produced in the women who moved through it. Women who had grown up inside the aristocratic formation understood, at an instinctive level, the specific requirements of emotional management that royal life imposed. They had absorbed, through the social world of their upbringing, the understanding that feelings were a private matter and that the performance of public roles required the suspension of private feeling for the duration of the performance. The suspension was not difficult for people who had been trained to it from childhood. Diana had not been trained to it. She was the daughter of an earl and had grown up in the appropriate houses with the appropriate social connections. But her childhood's specific character, the disrupted family, the parents' bitter divorce, the boarding school years that separated her from the domestic stability that her emotional sensitivity required, had not produced the self-contained composure that the aristocratic formation was supposed to provide. It had produced instead someone who felt things acutely and showed what she felt, who needed the emotional connection that her childhood had given her inconsistently, and whose hunger for that connection was genuine and intense, and not well managed by the mechanisms that the palace's world provided for emotional needs. Charles was not equipped to meet these needs. This is not an accusation, it is a statement about the specific character of his own formation, which had produced in him a man of considerable intellectual and emotional depth, whose capacity for intimate connection was complicated by the institutional expectations that had surrounded his entire life, and by the specific character of a father-son relationship that had emphasized the management of feeling over its expression in ways that made the expression difficult even when the feeling was genuine. He and Diana were not well matched. This was apparent to some of the people who were present for the courtship's accelerated development, but the institutional pressure to produce an heir and the specific political moment of the early 1980s, the monarchy's need for the rejuvenating public moment that a royal wedding provided, were pressures that operated on the decision about whether to proceed with the marriage in ways that the personal compatibility assessment could not override. The marriage proceeded. Diana moved into a household whose daily operations were managed according to an institutional logic that was not designed to accommodate her specific emotional character, and the accommodation problem began accumulating from the first weeks of the marriage in ways that the institutional apparatus was not equipped to address. The specific form the problem took was the form that unmet emotional need always takes in people for whom the need is acute and whose daily environment provides no adequate mechanism for meeting it: the intensification of the need, the increasingly obvious character of its unmet status, the daily experience of living in close proximity to the person whose failure to meet it is the most immediate available fact of the daily experience. Charles's absences, the public schedule, the tours, the engagements that the heir to the throne's calendar required, were not the cause of Diana's distress, but they were the specific form in which the problem expressed itself daily. He was not there. When he was there, the specific character of the dynamic between them was a dynamic that produced the experience of distance rather than proximity, of two people in the same room who were not, in the sense that mattered, in the same room. She was 22 years old, inside a marriage that was not providing the connection she needed, inside an institution that had no mechanism for providing it, inside a public life that required her to perform the appearance of a happiness she was not experiencing, inside a palace whose internal culture treated the performance's requirements as more important than the performer's actual state. Into this specific situation, Barry Mannakee arrived in 1983. The situation he arrived into explains the specific power of his impact on her in ways that a neutral account of his personal qualities alone would not explain. He was warm and attentive and present in ways that the other people in her daily life were not consistently warm and attentive and present. In any other circumstances, those qualities would have been pleasant and professionally appropriate and unremarkable. In the specific circumstances of Diana's daily experience in 1983, they were the specific provision of what the daily experience most acutely lacked. He was not simply a warm person she encountered. He was a warm person she encountered at the precise moment when the absence of warmth in her immediate world had made warmth's presence transformative rather than simply pleasant. The transformation happened gradually, in the way that transformations happen when the conditions for them have been prepared by the sustained absence of what the transformation provides. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of daily interactions, each of which added something to what the previous interactions had established. The accumulation produced the relationship that the palace found incompatible with the professional requirements of close protection. The palace's assessment of the incompatibility was correct in its immediate terms. A protection officer who has developed a personal relationship with the principal being protected is an officer whose professional judgment is potentially compromised by the personal relationship's competing claims on his attention and loyalty. The professional requirement is clear and is not unreasonable. What the professional requirement could not account for, and what the institutional logic had no mechanism for addressing, was what Diana's life was actually like inside the marriage that the palace's protection infrastructure was designed to protect. The protection requirement treated Diana's safety as the primary operational concern and her emotional well-being as a matter outside the protection role's scope. The protection role was correctly defined within those terms. The definition left the question of what happened to someone whose emotional well-being was acutely compromised within the terms of an institutional arrangement that the protection role was designed to sustain without question. Mannakee was the answer to a question the institution had not asked. His removal was the institutional response to a question the institution had asked. The question of whether the relationship between a protection officer and his principal met the professional standards required. The answer to the institutional question was no. The removal addressed the institutional question's answer. It did not address the question the institution had not asked. That question, what happens to the person whose emotional needs the institutional arrangement is meeting inadequately, remained unanswered after the removal, as it had remained unanswered before Mannakee's arrival, as it would remain unanswered for the remainder of Diana's time inside the institution that the removal was designed to protect. The institution's capacity for self-examination was precisely limited to the questions it had asked. It had asked whether the protection relationship was appropriate. It had found it was not, and had acted accordingly. It had not asked whether the circumstances that had made the relationship develop the character it had developed were circumstances that the institution itself had produced, and that the institution might therefore bear some responsibility for addressing. The removal answered the institutional question. The question the institution had not asked continued, unanswered, to shape the life of the woman whose situation had made the answer to the institutional question, in the human sense, beside the point. Diana lost Mannakee. The palace lost a personnel management problem. The two losses were not the same loss, and the difference between them is the difference that the institutional accounting of the situation consistently declined to measure. The question of what Barry Mannakee and Diana actually were to each other has been asked and answered in multiple forms across the decades since his death, and the answers have never converged into the settled account that the question's repeated asking might suggest it deserves. The reasons for this non-convergence are not the reasons that simple mysteries of historical fact produce, not the absence of witnesses or the unavailability of documentary evidence in the ordinary sense. The reasons are more specifically human. The principal witness to what the relationship was is dead. The secondary witnesses have had strong reasons for presenting versions of the relationship that served their own interests and positions, and the specific character of the relationship itself, whatever its character was, is the kind of thing that defies clean categorization, even when the people inside it are able to speak freely about it. Diana's own accounts of the relationship have reached the public record in three forms: each produced in different circumstances, and each carrying its own specific quality of reliability and its own specific quality of managed disclosure. The most famous account is the limousine conversation, the lip-read footage from the Paris trip in 1997, in which she described Mannakee as probably the greatest love of her life. The footage was not produced for public consumption and was not, at the time of the conversation, known to Diana to be recorded. This gives it a specific quality of authenticity that the other available accounts do not have. It is the statement of someone speaking without awareness of being recorded, in the specific register that awareness-free speech occupies. The second account is the Andrew Morton material, the tape-recorded conversations with Morton that produced the 1992 book, and that Diana made in full knowledge that the material was being recorded and that it was going to be used to produce a book whose publication she had sanctioned. The Morton material contains a description of the Mannakee relationship that is warmer and more specific than the palace's official version of an inappropriate professional attachment that was correctly managed through his removal, but it is also a description produced in the specific context of Morton's project, a project designed to present Diana's account of her royal life in the most sympathetic possible terms, whose framing was shaped by the political context of the marriage's dissolution and by Diana's own investment in a public narrative that positioned her as someone whose genuine emotional needs had been systematically ignored by the institution she had entered. The third account is the footage from the Bashir interview preparation, the material produced in the run-up to the Panorama broadcast of 1995, some of which has been available to researchers working on Diana's life, and which contains references to Mannakee in the specific context of Diana's broader account of the relationships that had sustained her across the years of the marriage's difficulties. This material is the least publicly available of the three accounts, and the least quoted in the public conversation about Mannakee, but it is consistent in its general character with the other accounts, consistent in positioning Mannakee as a relationship of genuine significance rather than as a professional attachment that had developed inappropriately. The consistency across the three accounts, made in different circumstances, to different audiences, across the decade between 1992 and 1997, is the most reliable available indicator of what Diana herself believed about the relationship's character. She was not a person who maintained consistent positions across a decade for strategic reasons alone. The specific circumstances of each account's production differed enough that a purely strategic presentation would have produced more variation than the accounts actually contain. The consistency suggests that the account she gave in each context was the account she actually held, rather than a strategically selected version of it. What the account she actually held says is that the relationship was the most significant romantic attachment of her life, that whatever the relationship's physical dimensions were, its emotional dimensions were of a depth and a significance that she measured against the other significant relationships of her adult life, and found they exceeded them. This is the statement of the limousine footage. It is consistent with the Morton material and with the Bashir preparation material. It is the account that Diana carried for the decade between Mannakee's death and her own. The question of the relationship's physical dimensions is the question that the official accounts and the unofficial ones have treated differently. The palace's position has been and remains the position that the relationship was inappropriate in ways that required the removal but did not constitute a sexual affair, that the inappropriate character was one of emotional intensity and professional boundary violation rather than physical intimacy. This position is the one that serves the palace's interests most directly, because the position that acknowledges inappropriate emotional attachment while denying physical involvement allows the removal to be characterized as professionally appropriate without generating the specific narrative that an acknowledged sexual affair between a married princess and a married police officer would have generated. The alternative position, that the relationship included physical dimensions that the palace was aware of or suspected and that the removal was designed to address, is the position that the conspiracy-adjacent accounts of Mannakee's life and death have most consistently occupied. These accounts are not uniform in their specific claims, but they share the general position that what the palace described as a professional boundary violation was actually a more complete relationship whose complete character the palace managed away through the removal's framing. The evidence for the alternative position is not established in the way that alternative historical positions need to be established to be taken seriously as historical claims rather than as speculation. There are accounts from people who claim to have been told by Diana that the relationship was physically intimate, but the second-hand character of these accounts of what Diana allegedly said to specific people in specific private conversations, places them in the category of reported testimony whose reliability depends on the specific credibility and memory of the specific reporters. What is established with greater certainty is the impact of the relationship on Diana, the significance she attributed to it across the decade of Mannakee's absence and death, the specific quality of the loss she experienced when he was removed from her daily life, and then when he died. The impact's character, its depth, its duration, its presence in Diana's self-understanding across the decade, is consistent with a relationship of the significance she described, whatever the precise nature of the relationship's physical dimensions. The palace's management of the relationship's character in the public record has been the management of a story that the palace has had strong interests in containing at the level of professional boundary violation, rather than allowing to develop into the more complicated narrative that the complete account of the relationship would have produced. The management has been largely successful. The Mannakee story has not entered the public consciousness with the same completeness or the same force as some of the other dimensions of Diana's private life, partly because his death in 1987 preceded the public phase of the disclosure culture that the Morton book and the Panorama interview subsequently produced, and partly because the palace's management of the story in the years between his removal and his death was sufficiently complete that the public narrative was already established before the disclosure culture made its revision possible. Diana's own accounts were the primary mechanism for revising that narrative, and she produced them in the specific forms available to her: the Morton material, the Bashir preparation, the limousine conversation, over a period that ended with her death in 1997. The revision she produced was incomplete in the sense that it never produced a full, named, public account of what she believed the relationship to have been. She described the emotional significance. She indicated the depth of the loss. She did not produce the specific account of the relationship's physical dimensions that would have required the public conversation to engage with those dimensions directly. Whether the incompleteness was strategic, a calculated management of what she was prepared to disclose publicly about a relationship whose full disclosure would have produced consequences she was not prepared to accept, or whether it reflected genuine uncertainty about how to characterize what had been, in the specific sense that profound emotional attachments are always genuinely difficult to characterize, is not clear from the available evidence. What is clear is that the relationship's incomplete disclosure left its character in the specific state of productive ambiguity that serves different interests for different parties: the palace, which benefits from the ambiguity's limiting of the full account; the conspiracy theorists, who benefit from the ambiguity's leaving the more dramatic account unclosed; and the people who genuinely wish to understand Diana's life, who are left with an account that is illuminating about her emotional experience while remaining unavoidably incomplete about the specific nature of what she was experiencing. The question of what Barry Mannakee and Diana actually were to each other is a question that the available evidence answers partially, and that the complete answer to has died with the only person who could have provided it completely. She said he was probably the greatest love of her life. The word probably suggests she was not certain. The word love suggests what the uncertainty was about. Both together suggest someone who knew with certainty that what existed had been profound and was uncertain only about which category of the profound it most completely occupied. That uncertainty, the uncertainty at the edge of something she knew was real and significant and irreversible, is where the truth of the relationship lives, and it lives there because that is the specific territory that the relationship itself inhabited, the territory between what a relationship is and what it becomes in the memory of the person who carries the loss of it. The decision to remove Barry Mannakee from Diana's protection detail was made in the summer of 1985. The decision was not made by a single identifiable person making a single identifiable decision, It was made through the institutional processes through which royal protection assignments are reviewed and adjusted. Processes that involve multiple layers of the Metropolitan Police's Royalty Protection Division, and that produce outcomes whose specific initiating cause is distributed across the institutional machinery rather than located in any single act of individual authority. This distributed character of the decision is itself significant. An institution that wants to remove a problem without creating a record of the problem's existence has institutional mechanisms available for achieving both ends simultaneously, and the removal of Mannakee was conducted through exactly these mechanisms. The removal was processed as a professional reassignment. The assessment that the assignment to Diana's protection detail was no longer appropriate, and the consequent transfer of the officer concerned back to general duties within the Metropolitan Police. The processing was professional and was documented in the professional terms that professional reassignments are documented in, which are terms that record the what of the outcome without recording the why of the decision in any form that makes the why publicly retrievable. The why that was not publicly recorded was the palace's assessment that the relationship between Mannakee and Diana had developed in ways that made the continuation of the assignment untenable. The specific character of that assessment, what information it was based on, who had gathered the information and how, what the specific incidents or observations that had triggered the assessment were, is not established in the public record in any form that would allow confident reconstruction. The accounts that have been produced by journalists and biographers working on the Mannakee story across the decades since his death have produced a general picture of an assessment produced by surveillance of the relationship's development, rather than by any specific incident that crossed a definitive threshold, but the specific details of the surveillance and the specific evidence it produced have not been established from sources that meet the standard of historical confidence. What is established is that the palace knew. Whether the knowledge came through the formal surveillance of Diana's communications that the intelligence accounts of the period suggest was more extensive than the official record acknowledges, or through the informal intelligence network that royal households maintain, through the accumulated observations of the staff who are always present and always watching, or through some combination of both, the palace had formed the view that the relationship required management and had managed it through the removal. The removal was presented to Mannakee as a professional reassignment and was processed within the Metropolitan Police's internal systems as such. He was not disciplined, he was not formally accused of any specific conduct. He was reassigned through the professional machinery in ways that produced no formal record of the specific reason for the reassignment, and that therefore denied him the opportunity for any formal response to a formal accusation that had not been made. This is the specific form of palace consequence that the institution has developed across centuries of managing situations whose full public acknowledgement would produce outcomes less manageable than the silence that the alternative processing produces. It is the form that James Hewitt's experience of his military career's conclusion also exemplifies: the removal through the closing of doors rather than through the formal proceedings that would create a record of why the doors were closed. The technique is effective because it produces the desired outcome without the institutional exposure that formal proceedings require, and because the person to whom it is applied has no formal mechanism for contesting a decision that has not been formally made against them. Mannakee returned to general duties within the Metropolitan Police. His colleagues' accounts of his conduct following the reassignment describe someone who maintained professional composure in the public dimensions of his work, while privately processing the specific loss that the reassignment represented. He did not speak publicly about the reassignment or about Diana. The professional discretion that the police institution required of its officers, combined with the specific character of a situation whose public acknowledgement would have produced consequences for himself and for Diana that neither party could have found acceptable, produced a silence that was maintained with the completeness that silences are maintained when the consequences of breaking them are sufficiently understood by the person maintaining them. Diana's experience of the removal has been described in the accounts of people close to her at the time in terms that convey genuine distress, not the performed distress of someone whose public persona required the expression of feeling, but the private distress of someone who had lost something real, and whose loss was being managed within a context that did not permit its acknowledgement. The people who were near her in the period following the removal describe a Diana who was visibly affected in ways that went beyond the appropriate sadness at the conclusion of a professional relationship, ways that were consistent with someone processing the loss of a genuinely significant personal connection. She did not communicate with Mannakee following the removal. The communication would have been monitored through the same intelligence infrastructure that had produced the knowledge leading to the removal, and the consequences of discovered communication for both parties would have been considerably worse than the consequences of the removal itself. The intelligence infrastructure was not something Diana was unaware of. She had been living inside it for 4 years by the time of the removal, and had developed the specific understanding of its operation that sustained proximity to surveillance produces in people who are perceptive enough to recognize what they are living inside. The recognition meant that the removal was genuinely final, in a way that removals only are when both parties understand that the consequences of reunion are worse than the consequences of permanent separation. Mannakee knew. Diana knew. The palace had produced, through the removal and through the surveillance infrastructure that enforced its permanence, a separation that was enforced not through formal prohibition, but through the shared understanding of what the alternative to the separation would cost. 9 months after the removal, Mannakee died on the A414 near Stevenage in Essex. He was a passenger on a motorcycle ridden by a colleague, Stephen Puddick. A car driven by a young woman named Nicola Chop pulled across the motorcycle's path at an intersection. The motorcycle collided with the car, and Mannakee was thrown from the vehicle and sustained injuries from which he did not recover. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's inquest into the death returned a verdict of accidental death. The investigation found no evidence of any external interference with the circumstances of the accident, no evidence that the car's driver was acting under instruction, no evidence that the accident was anything other than the collision between a motorcycle and a car pulling into its path that the witnesses described and the physical evidence supported. Diana was in Cannes at the Cannes Film Festival when the news reached her. The specific circumstances in which she was informed, who told her, in what terms, in what setting, have been described in accounts that differ in their details, in ways that suggest either the account's imperfect recollection of the specific logistical circumstances or the deliberate management of how the information was delivered to prevent the response to it from being visible to people who might record and report it. Her response, in whatever form it took in the immediate private moments following the notification, was a response that the people near her in Cannes that day have described with the care that people bring to descriptions of someone they watched receive very bad news about someone whose significance in their life was not publicly acknowledged. She was sad in ways that the professional relationship the palace had publicly characterized would not have fully explained. She was sad in ways that required management, the management of her own public composure in a setting where her composure was expected, and where the specific reason for any observed distress could not be acknowledged. The management produced the public surface. The private experience of the loss remained private, in the specific way that losses must remain private when the things being lost cannot be publicly claimed, and was carried privately for the remaining 10 years of her life. The palace's management of the Mannakee story, following his death, extended to the management of the coverage that the death generated in the press. The coverage was brief and was presented in terms that reflected the official narrative. A police officer who had briefly been assigned to royal protection had died in a motorcycle accident. The coverage did not pursue the circumstances of the assignment's conclusion. It did not investigate the timing of the death relative to the removal. It did not engage with the question of what the relationship between Mannakee and Diana had actually been. The coverage's briefness was not the result of editorial decisions made by journalists who had assessed the story and found it insufficiently significant. It was the result of the specific character of the palace's management of the information environment around the story, the management that royal households have always been able to apply to stories touching the privacy of their members through the informal but effective mechanisms of press relations that have operated between the palace and the Fleet Street editors for as long as the relationship has existed. The coverage disappeared. The story was managed into the archive of things that had been briefly noted and then left to the silence that the palace's information management produced. For the decade between Mannakee's death in 1987 and Diana's own death in 1997, the story remained in that silence. Then the limousine footage surfaced. Then the Morton material became fully public. Then the accounts produced by the people who had been near Diana across the years of her marriage and its dissolution began to fill the silence with the specific content that the palace's management had spent a decade ensuring it did not contain. The story came back. It came back because the person who had lived inside it for the decade of its silence had kept it alive in the specific way that people keep alive the things they cannot acknowledge publicly, by carrying them, in the precise form of their unacknowledged reality, through the years of the silence, until the silence ended. The intersection where Barry Mannakee died is on the A414 near Stevenage in Hertfordshire, a stretch of road that in 1987 had the specific character of an arterial route connecting the industrial and residential areas of the town, used heavily by commuters and workers and the ordinary traffic of a busy English county, and carrying no particular significance to anyone who travelled it before the night of the 11th of May 1987. Stephen Puddick was riding the motorcycle. Puddick was Mannakee's Metropolitan Police colleague, and the two men were travelling together. The specific circumstances of where they were going and why have not been fully established in any public account of the accident, which is one of the smaller, but not entirely insignificant gaps in the documented record of the events of that night. Nicola Chop was driving the car. She was 17 years old. The car she was driving pulled across the path of the motorcycle at the intersection, and the collision that followed was the collision whose outcome the coroner's inquest subsequently recorded. Puddick survived. His injuries were serious but not fatal. Mannakee was thrown from the motorcycle and suffered injuries that the attending medical personnel were unable to address successfully. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The inquest, conducted by the Hertfordshire coroner in the months following the accident, received evidence from the witnesses present at the scene, from the police officers who attended, from the medical personnel who responded, and from the accident investigation that the Metropolitan Police conducted into the circumstances. The inquest's verdict of accidental death was the verdict that the evidence presented to it supported. The evidence showed a motorcycle, a car, an intersection, and a collision whose circumstances were consistent with the kind of road accident that the specific junction's traffic conditions made possible. Nicola Chop was not prosecuted following the accident. The decision not to prosecute was made by the Crown Prosecution Service on the basis of the evidence available to it and the specific legal thresholds that the prosecution of road traffic accidents requires. The decision was not unusual, given the circumstances as they were established at the inquest. A young driver, an intersection, an accident whose cause was consistent with the collision of an inexperienced driver's failure to see the approaching motorcycle with the natural conditions of a wet evening road. Accidents of this kind happen with a regularity that the road traffic statistics document, and the decision not to prosecute reflected the legal assessment that this accident fell within the category whose circumstances do not meet the prosecution threshold. The conspiracy theories that developed around Mannakee's death in the years following Diana's public acknowledgement of the relationship's significance are theories whose specific claims vary considerably across their different versions, but that share the general premise that the accident was not an accident, that the specific circumstances of the death of a man who had been in a close relationship with the Princess of Wales 9 months after being removed from her protection detail require explanation beyond the coincidence of timing and the mechanical causation of a road collision. The most accessible version of the theory draws on the timing itself, the 9 months between removal and death, in the context of a palace infrastructure whose capacity for the management of inconvenient people and inconvenient information was well documented in other contexts. The theory's accessibility does not make it credible in the evidential sense, but its accessibility has sustained its circulation in the popular accounts of Diana's life across the decades since her death, and the circulation has been sustained partly by the gaps in the official record and partly by the specific credibility of the broader claim about palace intelligence infrastructure that Diana's own accounts of her life have supported. Diana herself contributed to the theory's currency. The Morton material contains a passage in which she describes having been told by someone. The specific identity of the someone is not established in the Morton account, that Mannakee had been bumped off. The use of that specific phrase, and her apparent belief that the information she had been given reflected something real about the circumstances of the death, has been reported and discussed across the subsequent decades as evidence of what Diana believed about what had happened to him. The belief, if it was a genuine belief rather than an expression of the suspicion that any person in Diana's circumstances might hold about the death of someone significant to her under the specific timing conditions that Mannakee's death presented, is itself significant evidence of what Diana's understanding of the world she was living inside had become by the time the Morton conversations were recorded. She was not a conspiracy theorist in the general sense. Her accounts of her experience of the palace were specific, named, and consistent with the evidence that has subsequently been produced from other sources. Her belief about Mannakee's death, whatever its evidential foundation, was a belief formed inside the specific understanding of the institutional world she was living in that her direct experience of that world had produced. The Stevens inquiry, which examined the circumstances of Diana's own death in 2006, and which addressed the conspiracy theories about Mannakee's death as part of its broader investigation of the claims that had been made about the palace's relationship to the deaths of people connected to Diana, concluded that there was no evidence to support the claim that Mannakee's death was anything other than the road accident the coroner's inquest had recorded. The conclusion was formed on the basis of the evidence available to the inquiry, and reflected the inquiry's assessment of that evidence within the standard of proof applicable to its investigation. The conclusion did not end the theories. Conspiracy theories are not typically ended by official inquiries, because the institutional character of official inquiries is itself part of the conspiratorial framework within which the theories operate. The inquiry's conclusion becomes evidence of the conspiracy's reach, rather than evidence of its absence. The Stevens inquiry's conclusions about Mannakee's death have been received in the wider discourse about Diana's life in exactly this way, with the people who hold the conspiracy theory treating the conclusion as confirmation of the institutional cover-up, rather than as refutation of the institutional involvement. This circular character of the discourse around Mannakee's death is the discourse that the specific combination of circumstances has produced: the timing, the relationship's character, the palace's acknowledged capacity for the management of its own exposure through the removal of inconvenient people from positions of proximity to the royal family, and the absence of any public accounting of the specific decision-making that produced the removal. Each of these elements on its own would be insufficient to sustain the theory. Their combination produces the specific quality of circumstantial coincidence that conspiracy theories require to survive in the absence of definitive evidence. The circumstantial coincidence is not evidence. It is not an argument. It is the specific collection of features of the documented record that produce, for people inclined to read them as requiring explanation, the question of whether the accident's circumstances are adequately explained by the accident's mechanics. For people not inclined to read them that way, the documented record explains itself: a young driver, a wet road, an intersection, a motorcycle, and the collision that the combination of these elements produced. The explanation is not dramatic. It does not require the palace's involvement. It requires only the ordinary occurrence of road accident causation that the documentation of the event's circumstances supports. What the documented record cannot provide, and what both the conspiracy theorists and the people who find the accident theory sufficient both acknowledge is absent, is the complete account of the events of that evening, the complete account of where Mannakee and Puddick were going and why, the complete account of what Nicola Chop's precise movements and decisions were in the moments before the collision, and the complete account of what, if anything, the palace's intelligence infrastructure was doing in relation to Mannakee in the months between his removal and his death. The gaps in this complete account are the gaps that the incomplete official record produces. They are real gaps, absences of documented information that would be relevant to a complete account of what happened and why. The gaps do not constitute evidence of conspiracy. They constitute evidence of incompleteness in the documented record. which is a different thing, and the difference matters for the specific character of the question that the gaps leave open. The question that the gaps leave open is not whether the palace was responsible for Mannakee's death. That question is not answerable from the available evidence in any direction that meets the standard of confident historical claim. The question the gaps leave open is the smaller and less dramatic question of whether the complete account of the events of the 11th of May 1987, the complete account, including the information the official record does not contain, would change the understanding of those events that the incomplete record produces. The answer to that smaller question is probably not. The mechanics of road accidents do not typically conceal conspiracies in the specific way that the dramatic version of the Mannakee story requires, and the specific circumstances documented at the scene are circumstances whose consistency with the accident theory is genuine rather than manufactured. But probably not is not certainly not, and the gap between those two formulations is the gap that the circumstantial coincidence fills with the specific quality of residual uncertainty that conspiracy theories inhabit and that official inquiries cannot entirely eliminate. The uncertainty is where Mannakee's death lives in the historical record, not in the settled territory of the demonstrated accident or in the claimed territory of the demonstrated conspiracy, but in the specific uncertain space between them that the incomplete record and the specific circumstances create, and that neither side of the debate has been able to resolve with the completeness that resolution requires. It is an uncomfortable space. It has been uncomfortable for 37 years. It will remain uncomfortable for as long as the official record remains incomplete, and the people who could complete it maintain the institutional silence that the record's incompleteness reflects. The specific quality of grief that Diana carried following Mannakee's death is one of the dimensions of her inner life that the public version of her story has most consistently failed to represent with any accuracy. The public story of Diana in 1987 was the story of a princess who was 3 years into the public dimensions of her charitable work, who was becoming the specific kind of royal figure that the public's response to her identified and encouraged, and who was navigating the specific difficulties of a marriage that the official presentation was still managing as a marriage in the ordinary institutional sense. The private story of Diana in 1987 was the story of someone who had lost, within the space of 9 months, the person she would later describe as the greatest love of her life, and then the person himself, first to the institutional removal that the palace's assessment of the relationship had produced, and then to the road in Hertfordshire where the accident occurred. The double loss, the loss through removal and then the permanent foreclosure of any possibility of return through death, produced the specific compound quality of grief that double losses of this kind always produce in people for whom the two losses are connected in ways that make each reinforce the other's pain. She could not grieve publicly. The relationship's character was not publicly acknowledged. The death was reported as the death of a police officer who had briefly served in royal protection, and the brevity of the official characterization of the connection between them made any visible grief on Diana's part inexplicable in the terms that the official characterization provided. Inexplicable grief in a public figure attracts exactly the kind of press attention that the palace was most invested in preventing in the period following the death, and the specific quality of the attention it would have attracted, the attention of journalists who would have pursued the question of what the inexplicable grief indicated about the relationship that had produced it, was attention that no one in Diana's immediate world had any interest in facilitating. She managed the grief in the way that people manage grief that cannot be publicly expressed, by carrying it in the private register of her daily experience, by processing it through the indirect channels that private grief always finds when direct expression is unavailable, and by containing it within the specific relationships in her life where the containment could be less complete without the incompleteness producing public consequences. The relationships where the containment was less complete were the relationships she had with the small number of people who knew enough about the Mannakee connection to understand what the death had actually cost her. These people, friends, confidants, the small circle of people whose access to Diana's private world had been established through sustained personal connection rather than through the palace's institutional apparatus, received the grief in the forms it took when the institutional management of its expression was relaxed by the privacy of the setting. The grief was real, and it was sustained. The accounts of people who knew Diana across the years following Mannakee's death described someone who carried the loss in ways that were visible to people close enough and attentive enough to see what the carrying looked like from the inside. She referenced him in private conversations across the years, not constantly, not in ways that suggested she had not processed the loss, but in ways that suggested the loss was a permanent feature of her understanding of her own history, rather than something that the passage of time had resolved into a manageable past. The Morton Conversations, recorded in 1991, 4 years after the death, contain references to Mannakee that reflect this sustained quality. She was not speaking about him in the register of someone whose grief has passed and whose memories are historical rather than live. She was speaking about him in the register of someone for whom the loss was present in the specific way that significant losses remain present in the people who carry them, not as fresh wounds, but as permanent alterations in the person's understanding of what their life has contained and what it has not. The grief's sustained quality across 4 years tells you something important about the relationship's significance that the official characterization of professional boundary violation does not capture. Professional boundary violations, even those that involve genuine emotional investment, do not typically produce the kind of sustained grief that the accounts of Diana's internal life across the 4 years between Mannakee's death and the Morton recordings describe. Professional attachments that develop beyond their appropriate parameters produce discomfort and perhaps regret at the loss of the professional relationship, but they do not produce, in the person who experienced them, the specific quality of grief whose presence across years reflects the loss of something that mattered at the deepest available level of personal significance. The grief's sustained quality is the most direct available evidence of the relationship's depth, and it is evidence that the official narrative of a professional boundary violation cannot accommodate without the accommodation requiring the official narrative to become something different from what it has maintained itself to be. What Diana did with the loss across the decade between Mannakee's death and her own is the account that the focus on the relationship itself and its end has partially obscured. The loss shaped the subsequent decade of her life in ways that the public account of that decade, the charitable work, the marriage's dissolution, the public disclosure campaign, the panorama interview, does not fully reveal as the product of the specific interior landscape that the loss had produced. The loss contributed to what Diana became across the decade of its carrying. The woman who sat across from Martin Bashir in 1995 and spoke about loneliness and isolation and the specific experience of living inside an institution that did not acknowledge her emotional needs was a woman who had been carrying for 8 years the specific knowledge of what it felt like to have that acknowledgement briefly available and then permanently removed. The loneliness she described was not simply the loneliness of a marriage's failure. It was the loneliness of someone who had experienced the contrast, who had known, for a period, the specific relief that genuine human attention provides to someone for whom its absence has been the defining condition of their daily experience, and who had been living for 8 years with the specific quality of loneliness that the knowledge of contrast always produces. Mannakee had given her the contrast. The palace had removed it. His death had made the removal permanent. The decade she spent after his death was the decade of someone navigating a world whose specific emotional landscape had been altered by the contrast's availability and the contrast's ending, and the navigation took the forms that the public account of her life records, without always recognizing the specific interior landscape from which the navigation proceeded. The charitable work's specific emotional character, the directness of her engagement with the people she visited, the specific quality of physical warmth she brought to interactions with the ill and the isolated and the suffering, reflects the interior landscape of someone for whom the knowledge of what warmth's presence and absence both feel like was genuinely embodied rather than intellectually understood. She was not visiting AIDS patients and leprosy sufferers and homeless people because she had been told it would be good for the monarchy's public image. She was visiting them because the specific quality of her own experience had produced in her a genuine understanding of what the absence of ordinary human warmth felt like from the inside, and the understanding had produced the specific compassion whose authenticity the people she visited consistently describe. The loss was the teacher of this understanding. The understanding was the most significant available legacy of the loss, the transformation of a private experience of deprivation into a public capacity for connection that distinguished Diana's charitable work from the performed compassion that royal charitable engagement often produces. The distinction was visible and was received by the people she visited as real, which is why the accounts of her interactions with suffering people, the reaching out, the holding of hands, the sitting on beds, the conversations conducted in the register of genuine rather than managed engagement, have the quality they have and have been remembered as they have been remembered. She did not acknowledge this publicly. She could not acknowledge it publicly in the terms that would have required her to acknowledge what the understanding had been derived from. She carried the understanding as she carried the grief, in the private register of an interior life, that the public Diana's requirements consistently demanded she manage, rather than express. The public Diana was the product of the private Diana's management of what the private Diana actually was. What the private Diana actually was, in the decade following Mannakee's death, was someone navigating the permanent absence of something real and transformative and irreversible. The navigation produced the public Diana. The public understood the product without knowing its source. The source remained in the private register, where Diana kept the things that the public life required her to keep private. The limousine footage from 1997 is the moment when the private register briefly became visible, the unguarded moment in the Paris car, when the management of what she was less complete than it was in the public occasions, and when the person managing it said what she actually thought to someone she trusted in the relative privacy of a moving car. Probably the greatest love of her life, the decade of carrying it, visible in 2 words. The 2 words visible in the silent footage of her lips in a Paris limousine, 10 years after the road in Hertfordshire, 2 months before her own death, on a different road, on a different continent, in the early hours of a different August morning. Janet Mannakee was 38 years old when her husband died. She had been married to Barry for 15 years, and the marriage had produced 2 children whose ages at the time of the accident placed them in the specific vulnerability of the childhood years, when a parent's sudden violent death produces disruptions that the subsequent decades of development are shaped around. The children were not infants. They were old enough to understand that their father was gone, and young enough that the understanding was received without the specific resources that adult processing of loss provides. They were children who lost their father on a Tuesday evening in May on a road in Hertfordshire, and the losing shaped the lives that followed in the ways that such losses always shape lives. Janet Mannakee has not spoken publicly about her husband's death or about the circumstances surrounding it. This silence has been maintained across the nearly 4 decades since the accident, with a consistency that the various journalists and researchers who have worked on the Mannakee story across that period have encountered as an absolute rather than as a negotiable position. She has declined interviews. She has declined requests for comment. She has declined, as far as the public record indicates, every approach from the press and from documentary makers and from authors whose interest in her husband's story created interest in her experience of it. The silence is hers to maintain. It requires no justification to anyone who understands that the bereaved have rights over their own grief, that the public's interest in the circumstances of a death does not override. A woman who lost her husband in a road accident has no obligation to discuss the loss with journalists or documentary makers or the readers and viewers whose interest in the story her silence is frustrating. And the frustration of that interest is not evidence that the silence is motivated by anything beyond the entirely reasonable desire of a grieving person to keep their grief private. The specific circumstances of Janet Mannakee's silence, however, are circumstances that go beyond the simple privacy of grief, because the silence is being maintained in the context of a story whose public dimensions have not been privately chosen by the Mannakee family. The public dimensions of the story, Diana's description of Barry Mannakee as the greatest love of her life, the conspiracy theories about the circumstances of his death, The sustained interest of the Diana industry in the relationship and its ending are dimensions that the family has not produced and cannot control, and yet whose existence in the public domain has made the family a subject of sustained public interest that they have not invited. This is the specific unfairness that the Mannakee story produces for the family, an unfairness that the public account of the story has not examined with the attention it warrants. The family lost a husband and a father to a road accident. The circumstances of the death then became entangled, through Diana's own public acknowledgements and through the conspiracy theorists' elaboration of the timing's significance, with the most sustained royal controversy of the late 20th century. The entanglement was not the family's doing. The entanglement's consequences, the decades of press interest, the periodic resurgence of the story in anniversary coverage and documentary series, the conspiracy theories that variously cast the dead man as a victim of palace assassination, have been consequences that the family has had to navigate without the specific resources that being at the center of one's own story provides. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The children who grew up without their father grew up in the specific knowledge that their father's name was periodically in the newspapers and on the television in connection with the Princess of Wales. The specific quality of that knowledge, the knowledge that the most private loss of their childhood was simultaneously a public story whose public character they had no control over, is a specific experience that the public account of the Mannakee story has not attended to with any sustained seriousness. The conspiracy theories are the dimension of the public story that the family has been most directly harmed by. A conspiracy theory that claims someone was murdered by agents of the British state is not simply an alternative hypothesis about the circumstances of an accidental death. It is a claim whose existence in the public domain changes how the death is talked about, how the person who died is discussed, and how the family of the person who died relates to the public narrative about their family member. If you are the child of someone whose death is claimed by conspiracy theorists to have been an assassination, you are navigating the public dimension of your parent's death in a way that the child of someone whose accidental death is not disputed does not have to navigate. The specific consequence this produces is the specific consequence of being unable to mourn publicly in the ordinary way, unable to discuss a parent's death without the discussion immediately entering the territory of a controversy that the mourner has no stake in sustaining, but from which the public interest makes retreat impossible, without the retreat being interpreted as evidence of something. The children of Barry Mannakee have been living with this for nearly 4 decades. The conspiracy theories have also affected how the people who knew Mannakee professionally have been able to discuss him publicly. His Metropolitan Police colleagues, the people who worked alongside him in the Royalty Protection Division and in the general duties role he returned to after the removal, have maintained the same silence that Janet Mannakee has maintained, partly through the professional discretion that police officers maintain about their work, and partly through the specific character of a situation in which speaking about Mannakee requires navigating the conspiracy theories and the Diana connection in ways that the professional discretion culture makes uncomfortable. The effect of all this silence, the family's silence, the colleagues' silence, the professional discretion of the institution he served, is that the public account of Barry Mannakee is an account produced almost entirely by people who did not know him well or at all, and that the specific quality of the man, the character, the professional reputation, the person who existed before and beyond the relationship with Diana that the public account has reduced him to, has been lost in the reduction. He was a police officer for over a decade before he was assigned to royal protection. He was a husband and a father. He was a person whose daily life contained the specific texture of daily life that every person's daily life contains, the habits, the friendships, the professional satisfactions and frustrations, the particular way of being in the world that the people who knew him would recognize, and that the people who know him only through the public account of his connection to Diana have no access to. The reduction of a person to the most publicly significant episode of their life is the specific violence that the Diana industry has done to Mannakee, the specific violence of the celebrity narrative, which absorbs peripheral figures into the story of the central celebrity and leaves them as one-dimensional accessories to the celebrity's account of her own life, rather than as three-dimensional people whose own lives had their own primary texture. Barry Mannakee's primary texture was not his relationship with Diana. Diana was one of the things that happened in the life of a man who had a wife and children and a career and a history and a daily existence that the public account has not attempted to recover. The public account has not attempted to recover it because the public account's interest is in Diana rather than in Mannakee, and Mannakee is in the public account only as a feature of Diana's story rather than as a subject in his own right. The family has maintained its silence in the face of the Diana industry's sustained interest in the story, partly because speaking would require engaging with a narrative about their family member that they have no power to shape, and partly because the privacy they have maintained is the only available mechanism for protecting the specific human being, the husband, the father, the police officer, from being further reduced to the one-dimensional accessory that the public account has made of him. The silence is protective. It protects what the family still has of the person they actually knew, the private memory of the man whose public reduction they cannot prevent, but whose private reality they can sustain by keeping it private. Janet Mannakee knows who her husband was. The children know who their father was. The colleagues who worked alongside him know who the officer was. None of them have chosen to share what they know with the public that has been told a version of who he was by the people with interests in that version. Diana, the conspiracy theorists, the journalists whose stories have been built on the publicly available fragments of a life the public has been given very few fragments of. The fragments the public has are the fragments that served other people's narratives. The complete person they fail to constitute is the person the family has protected through 4 decades of silence that the public account has not examined with the sympathy that the examination requires. He was a police sergeant from Essex who was assigned to protect a princess and who died on a road in Hertfordshire 9 months after the assignment ended. He was also a husband and a father whose family has been living inside the public account of that man without having chosen to be there and without having the specific resources that being the subject of one's own story provides. Their story is the part of the Mannakee account that the Diana industry has never been interested in telling, because it is the part that does not serve the Diana narrative. It serves only the claim that the man at the center of the story was a person rather than an episode, and that the people who loved him are people rather than incidental context for an account of someone else's grief. He was a person, they are people. The reduction is the record's failure, not the family's. Close protection work is one of the more psychologically demanding professional roles available in British policing, and the demands it places on the people who perform it are demands whose specific character the formal training for the role addresses incompletely. The training addresses the tactical dimensions, the physical competence, the threat assessment protocols, the specific operational procedures that close protection work requires, with thoroughness and professional rigor. It addresses the psychological dimensions of the role, the sustained proximity to significant figures, the management of the relationship between protector and protected, the specific emotional territory that the role's intimacy creates, with considerably less thoroughness, partly because the psychological dimensions are harder to train, and partly because the culture of the police institution that produces close protection officers is a culture in which the psychological demands of professional roles are not the dimensions most naturally acknowledged. The sustained proximity that close protection work requires is proximity of a specific and unusual character. A protection officer who is performing their role correctly is an officer who is simultaneously as close to the protected principle as the threat assessment requires and as invisible as the social requirements of the principle's environment permit. The simultaneous requirement for proximity and invisibility produces a specific professional stance. The alert attention that sees everything while appearing to see nothing, the maintained awareness of the principal's position and condition at every moment without the maintenance of that awareness ever becoming visible as surveillance rather than as professional presence. This stance, maintained across the daily operations of close protection work, produces in the officer a specific knowledge of the person being protected that is unlike the knowledge produced by any other professional relationship. The doctor knows the patient's body. The therapist knows the patient's mind. The protection officer knows the person as a person moving through the world, knows the specific quality of their movement through it, the particular way they inhabit their own public presence, the difference between the performance of the public role and the person performing it, the specific moments when the performance requires effort and the specific moments when it is effortless, and the specific character of the human being that exists in the transitions between performances. This knowledge is intimate without being personal, in the reciprocal sense that personal knowledge usually requires. The protection officer knows the principal through sustained observation of the principal's daily life, but the knowledge does not flow in both directions in the way that personal relationships produce knowledge. The principal typically knows the protection officer in the more limited way that one knows the people whose professional role places them consistently in one's environment, knows them as a presence, as a professional, as someone whose specific character has been established through daily contact, but not in the fully reciprocal way that mutual disclosure between equals produces. When the protection relationship develops beyond the professional parameters, when the officer begins to respond to what the sustained observation of the principal has produced in the officer, and when the principal begins to engage with the officer in ways that exceed the boundaries of the professional relationship, the specific character of the existing relationship shapes the character of what it becomes. The officer already knows the principal in the specific intimate way that sustained observation produces. The development of a relationship beyond professional parameters is therefore not the beginning of knowledge between the two people, but the acknowledgement of knowledge that the professional relationship has already created on the officer's side, and that the principal's engagement with the officer now begins to reciprocate. This dynamic, the development of a relationship from an existing foundation of intimate observational knowledge rather than from the equal starting point that most relationship formation involves, is the specific dynamic that the Mannakee-Diana relationship exemplifies. He had been observing her daily across the 2 years of the assignment before the relationship's development beyond professional parameters began to generate the palace's concern. The 2 years of observation had produced in him a knowledge of her that the relationship's subsequent development did not create, but acknowledged and responded to. For Diana, the relationship's development offered something that reciprocated the knowledge, someone who received her, having observed her, with the specific quality of engaged attention that the observation had produced in the observer. The person who is seen clearly and then engaged with on the basis of that clear seeing is the person who has the experience of being genuinely known, and the experience of being genuinely known is the experience that Diana's accounts of what Mannakee provided most consistently point toward. The protection officers who have spoken about the dynamics of close protection work, not in relation to the Mannakee case specifically, but in the general accounts of the role's psychological character that have been produced across the years of the profession's development as a subject of academic and journalistic interest, consistently describe the specific psychological risk of the role's intimate proximity. The risk is not primarily the risk of the protective relationship developing into something more personal, though that risk is acknowledged. The risk is more broadly the risk of what sustained proximity to a significant person in crisis produces in the officer who is maintaining it, the specific vulnerability to the human claim of someone who is suffering and who is close to you professionally, in ways that make you one of the most available people for the claim to be made on. Diana was suffering inside the marriage's failure in 1983 when Mannakee arrived at the assignment. The suffering was not hidden from the people close enough to observe it. A close protection officer whose assignment required him to be close enough to observe it was therefore close enough to be made a claim on by the suffering's existence, and the specific character of Mannakee's warmth and social intelligence, the qualities that had made him effective in the protection role, were precisely the qualities that made him susceptible to the claim in the most direct available way. He responded. The response was professional in the sense that it expressed itself within the professional context rather than outside it. He was not pursuing a relationship outside the professional context, but responding, within the daily operations of the protection role, to what the daily operations required him to be present for. The response eventually produced the dynamic that the palace's oversight of the protection detail identified as professionally inappropriate. The identification was accurate. The professional boundary had been exceeded. The excess was the natural outcome of a specific combination of circumstances: a protection officer of exceptional social intelligence and genuine warmth, assigned to a principal in acute emotional distress, in a daily proximity that gave the officer sustained observational knowledge of the distress and the human claim the distress represented. The Metropolitan Police's Royalty Protection Division has procedures for managing the risk that this combination produces. The procedures involve monitoring the relationships between protection officers and protected principals through the mechanisms available to the division, and acting on the monitoring's results when those results indicate that the professional parameters are being exceeded. The procedures were applied in the Mannakee case and produced the removal. The procedures are sensible. The risk they address is real. The specific human cost of the procedures application in the Mannakee case is what the procedures, being institutional procedures rather than instruments of human understanding, are not designed to account for. The human cost is the cost that the previous parts of this account have attempted to document: the cost to Diana of the removal, the cost to Mannakee of the removal, and the cost to the Mannakee family of the death that followed 9 months later. These costs are not the procedure's responsibility in any direct causal sense. The procedures managed the professional risk correctly. The professional risk managed correctly does not prevent the human costs that the professional management creates. The protection detail that continues to guard the members of the royal family operates within the same professional parameters that the Mannakee case defined and reinforced. The officers assigned to current members of the royal family are officers whose professional formation includes the specific awareness of the Mannakee case's significance in the history of the role's management, an awareness that the case is known within the protection culture as the defining example of what the professional parameters exist to prevent. The awareness produces the specific professional vigilance that the Mannakee case was intended to install, the heightened attention to the boundaries of the protection relationship, the more systematic oversight of officer-principal dynamics, the more structured procedures for managing the relationships between the people who protect royals and the royals who are protected by them. These improvements in procedure have been produced at the specific cost that the Mannakee case represents. The improvements are real and are valuable and are the institutional legacy of a case whose human dimensions the institution was not designed to accommodate. The human dimensions are the ones this account has tried to hold in view alongside the institutional ones: the specific person who died, the specific woman who loved him, the specific family who lost him, and the specific relationship that the palace's institutional logic processed and removed and then watched die on a Hertfordshire road, without producing any public account of what the losing and the removing and the dying had actually cost the human beings at the centre of the institutional management's efficient conclusion. Lord Stevens was 70 years old when the Metropolitan Police Commissioner asked him to lead the inquiry into the circumstances of Diana's death. He was a former commissioner of the Metropolitan Police himself, a man whose career had included the investigation of some of the most sensitive and contested cases in British policing history, including the investigation of alleged collusion between the security forces and loyalist paramilitaries in Northern Ireland. The inquiry he was asked to lead was called Operation Paget, and it produced a report in December 2006, 9 years after Diana's death, that ran to 800 pages and addressed, with varying degrees of thoroughness, the conspiracy theories that had circulated since the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Mannakee occupied a specific place in the Operation Paget inquiry's scope. The inquiry was examining the claim that the British security services had arranged or facilitated Diana's death, and the Mannakee dimension of the broader claim held that his own death 9 years earlier was evidence of the security services' willingness and capacity to arrange the deaths of people connected to Diana whose continued existence represented a threat to the palace's interests. If Mannakee had been killed because of his relationship to Diana, the argument ran, it demonstrated that the services had both the motive and the methodology to repeat the operation in Paris a decade later. The inquiry examined this dimension of the conspiracy theory with the investigative resources available to a major inquiry of this kind. Access to police records, to intelligence files, to the witnesses, and the surviving participants in the events being examined. The examination produced the conclusion that there was no evidence to support the claim that Mannakee's death was anything other than the accidental road death that the 1987 inquest had recorded, and that the timing's coincidence with his removal from Diana's protection detail, while naturally productive of the suspicions it had produced, was not supported by any evidence of the kind that would be required to sustain the claim of deliberate interference with the circumstances of the accident. The conclusion was stated clearly and was based on the examination of the available evidence. Its clarity has not prevented the conspiracy theories from continuing to circulate, which is consistent with the specific character of conspiracy theories rather than evidence of the conclusion's inadequacy. Conspiracy theories that have been sustained for decades do not typically dissolve in response to the conclusions of official inquiries, partly because the theory's internal logic accommodates the inquiry's conclusion by questioning the inquiry's independence, and partly because the emotional investment in the theory's truth is frequently more substantial than the evidential investment, and is therefore less susceptible to evidential refutation. What the Stevens inquiry could not do, what no official inquiry could do within the constraints of the evidence available, and the remit under which the inquiry operated, was provide the complete account of the circumstances surrounding Mannakee's removal and death, that the absence of such a complete account has allowed the conspiracy theories to occupy. The inquiry could find no evidence of deliberate interference. It could not find, and was not positioned to produce, the complete account of the palace's intelligence assessment of the Mannakee-Diana relationship, the specific surveillance that the assessment produced, and the specific information about Mannakee that the intelligence infrastructure held in the months between his removal and his death. The absence of this complete account is not evidence of conspiracy. It is evidence of the specific character of intelligence operations and their relationship to public accountability. The character that keeps the specific operational details of surveillance programs and security assessments outside the reach of any inquiry whose remit does not extend to the full disclosure of classified intelligence material. The Stevens inquiry did not have access to the full classified intelligence record of the palace's security apparatus, because the full classified intelligence record of the palace's security apparatus is not something that inquiries into specific incidents automatically gain access to. The limitations of the inquiry's access are the limitations that the intelligence world's relationship to public accountability consistently produces, the specific gap between what the official record contains and what the classified record contains, which is the gap that conspiracy theories consistently inhabit, because the gap cannot be closed by anything short of the full declassification of the classified record, which the intelligence world has never agreed to produce and is unlikely to agree to produce. Operation Paget's conclusions about the Mannakee dimension of the broader conspiracy claim were received in the public discourse about Diana's death in the way that such conclusions are typically received, accepted by the people who were looking for the confirmation that the accident theory was correct, and disputed by the people who had invested in the conspiracy theory as the account that the specific circumstances required. The people who found the conclusions inadequate pointed to the specific gaps in the inquiry's access, the classified intelligence material, the complete record of the palace's security assessment of Mannakee, and the relationship, as evidence that the conclusions were formed on an incomplete evidential foundation. This criticism is technically accurate and is insufficient. All official conclusions are formed on incomplete evidential foundations in the sense that no inquiry ever has access to the complete record of everything that is relevant to the questions it is examining. The specific incompleteness of Operation Paget's access to the intelligence record is real, but does not by itself make the inquiry's conclusions less reliable than the conclusions of an inquiry with complete access would have been. Complete access might have confirmed the conspiracy, and it might have confirmed the accident, and the absence of complete access leaves both possibilities technically open, while the inquiry's analysis of the available evidence supports one of them. The specific form that the Mannakee conspiracy theories have taken in the years following Operation Paget reflects the specific character of the evidence available to support them. Evidence that is circumstantial, timing-dependent, and coherent within its own internal logic, without being coherent within the evidential standards that historical conclusions require. The theories have not produced a named individual who is claimed to have participated in or arranged the accident. They have not produced documentary evidence of the kind that would transform the circumstantial case into an evidenced one. They have not produced the specific disclosure that would require the official version of events to be revised. The official version of events remains the accidental death version, the version that the 1987 inquest produced and that the 2006 inquiry confirmed. The official version's survival across 37 years is not, in itself, evidence of the official version's truth. Official versions of contested historical events sometimes survive not because they are true, but because the alternative accounts have not produced the specific evidence required to displace them. But the official version's survival across 37 years of sustained public interest in the question, during which multiple journalists and researchers and documentary makers have applied considerable resources to the investigation, does suggest that the specific evidence required to displace it is not available to people who are looking for it and are motivated to find it. The absence of the evidence does not prove the accident theory. It proves only that the conspiracy theory's advocates have not found the evidence for their version in 37 years of looking. The not finding is consistent with the evidence not existing, and also with the evidence being sufficiently well protected by the intelligence infrastructure that it has not been located by people who lack the institutional access required to find it. The two interpretations of the same fact, evidence not found because it does not exist, or evidence not found because the protection of it has been sufficiently effective, are the two interpretations between which the official conclusion and the conspiracy theory occupy their respective positions. The official conclusion occupies the first interpretation. The conspiracy theory occupies the second. Both are logically consistent with the fact of the evidence not being found. Neither can be confirmed as the correct interpretation without the evidence itself, which is the evidence that has not been found. This is the specific logical position that the Mannakee story occupies in the historical record, a position determined by the specific character of the evidence available, the specific limitations of the inquiries conducted, and the specific gap between the classified and the declassified records that the intelligence world's relationship to public accountability consistently produces. The position is uncomfortable. It does not resolve into the clean answer that either the accident theory or the conspiracy theory would produce if the evidence required to confirm one of them were available. It resolves instead into the specific uncertainty that the specific character of the available evidence produces, an uncertainty that is epistemically honest and unsatisfying in equal measure, and that provides no comfort to the people for whom the specific truth of what happened on the A414 on the evening of the 11th of May, 1987, is a question they need answered, rather than a historical puzzle they are intellectually engaged by. The people for whom it is a question they need answered are the Mannakee family. They have been living inside the official conclusion for 37 years. They have not challenged it publicly. They have not advocated for any alternative account. They have maintained the silence that the previous part of this account has examined. The silence of people who have the most personal stake in the answer to the question is not evidence that they have accepted the official answer. It is evidence that they have concluded, across 37 years, that the public forum is not the forum in which the answer they need is going to be produced, and that the costs of continued engagement with the public forum are costs that the dignity of their private grief is better protected by refusing to pay. The Stevens inquiry closed officially. The questions it could not close remain open. The family's silence is the most dignified available response to the specific character of those questions, the response of people who understand that some questions do not get answered in the public record, and who have chosen to live with the understanding, rather than to perform the seeking of answers in the forum, where the seeking will not produce them. The British state's surveillance of Diana, Princess of Wales, is one of the most extensively documented yet least publicly understood dimensions of her experience of royal life. Documented in the sense that multiple former intelligence officers, journalists working on the topic across several decades, and Diana's own accounts of her experience of being monitored have established, beyond reasonable dispute, that the surveillance existed and was more extensive than the palace's official account of its royal protection infrastructure acknowledges. Least publicly understood in the sense that the specific operational details of what was collected, by whom, through what mechanisms, and what was done with what was collected, remain classified in ways that prevent the complete account from being assembled from publicly available material. The surveillance of royal family members by British intelligence services is not, in itself, remarkable or nefarious. The protection of the monarch and the senior members of the royal family from genuine security threats, assassination attempts, kidnap, the specific forms of political violence that the IRA and other organizations directed at royal targets across the decades of Mannakee's service, requires the intelligence infrastructure to maintain awareness of the movements and communications of the people being protected and of the people around them. The monitoring of people who are in the intimate vicinity of members of the royal family is a natural extension of the protection requirement, and the monitoring of Barry Mannakee, a police officer assigned to the personal protection of the Princess of Wales, who had developed a relationship with her of the character the palace found concerning, would have been a monitoring activity that the protection requirement provided clear justification for. What this monitoring produced, and what was done with what it produced, is the dimension of the surveillance story that the classified record contains and the public record does not. The palace's knowledge of the Mannakee-Diana relationship's character, the knowledge that produced the assessment that led to the removal, was knowledge produced through the monitoring. The specific evidence that the monitoring generated, the specific communications or observations or reports that formed the evidential basis for the assessment, are not in the public record. The absence of the monitoring's specific content from the public record is the absence that allows the conspiracy theories to function. If the monitoring's complete record were available, it would either show evidence of the deliberate planning of harm that the conspiracy theories require, or it would show only the evidence of a professional relationship that had exceeded its parameters in the ways the official account describes. Either showing would close the question in a specific direction. The absence of the showing leaves the question open in the specific territory that the conspiracy theories occupy. GCHQ's monitoring of communications involving members of the royal family and people in their immediate vicinity is an activity that former intelligence officers have described in general terms without providing the specific operational details that would make the general description verifiable. The general description is of a monitoring capability that extended to the communications of people in Diana's immediate world during the 1980s and 1990s, operated through the technical infrastructure that GCHQ's signals intelligence capability provided, and that produced material that was distributed to recipients within the intelligence and security structure who were assessed to have a legitimate interest in it. Whether Barry Mannakee's communications were among those monitored is not established in any public account with the specificity that confident assertion requires. The general description of the monitoring capability is sufficient to establish that the capability existed and that its application to people in Diana's immediate world was within the operational parameters of the intelligence infrastructure as it operated during this period. Whether the capability was applied to Mannakee specifically is the specific question that the general description cannot answer. What can be established from the multiple independent accounts of the palace's knowledge of the Mannakee-Diana relationship that have been produced across the decades since the removal is that the palace had detailed knowledge of the relationship's development before the removal was enacted. The detailed character of the knowledge, the specific quality of the assessment that the removal was based on, as reflected in the accounts of people who were within the palace's inner circle at the time, is consistent with knowledge produced through active monitoring rather than through the informal observation of the people in Diana's immediate household environment. The informal observation, the accumulated reports of the ladies-in-waiting and the household staff, and the people whose daily proximity to Diana produced observations that they communicated upward through the household's reporting structures, would have produced a picture of the relationship's existence and general character. The more specific knowledge of the relationship's particular dimensions that the removal's timing and completeness suggest the palace possessed is knowledge that the informal observation alone is unlikely to have produced with the specificity that the assessment appears to have required. The MI5 file on Diana, the existence of which has been confirmed through the parliamentary process that required the intelligence services to acknowledge the files they maintained on members of the public who were assessed to be of intelligence interest, is a file whose contents remain classified. The file's existence was confirmed in response to a parliamentary question in the years following her death. Its contents were not disclosed and are not going to be disclosed through any process currently available to people seeking to understand what it contains. The file's existence is significant not because its specific contents are known, but because its existence confirms that the intelligence infrastructure maintained an active file on Diana during her lifetime, that she was assessed as being of sufficient intelligence interest to warrant the maintenance of a classified record of information about her. The specific character of that assessment, what made Diana of intelligence interest to MI5, is not established by the file's existence alone, but the context in which the intelligence community in general assessed individuals as warranting files of this kind provides some indication. The intelligence community's interest in individuals during this period was an interest generated by the potential security implications of the individual's connections and activities. For Diana, the potential security implications would have included the security dimensions of her personal relationships, the question of whether the people in her intimate world had connections or characteristics that created security risks for the person they were close to. The Mannakee relationship, from this perspective, was a relationship whose security dimensions the intelligence infrastructure would have had a legitimate professional reason to be interested in. The surveillance of Diana's immediate world in 1985, the year of Mannakee's removal, was therefore surveillance that served the protection requirement in its legitimate form, while simultaneously serving the palace's interest in managing a relationship that the protection infrastructure had identified as professionally inappropriate. The two interests, protection and management, were both served by the same surveillance activity, and the material the surveillance produced served both purposes simultaneously. This is the specific ambiguity at the heart of the intelligence dimension of the Mannakee story. The ambiguity between the legitimate protection purpose that the surveillance served and the institutional management purpose that the same surveillance also served, without the two purposes being distinguishable from each other in the operational record, because the same activity served both. The people who operated the surveillance were operating a protection intelligence function. The material they produced was used for a protection assessment that resulted in the removal of a protection officer. The removal served the protection function and simultaneously served the management of a personal relationship that the institution found incompatible with its requirements. The surveillance, the assessment, and the removal all look like professional protection decisions made by professional protection people. They were professional protection decisions made by professional protection people. They were also, simultaneously, institutional management decisions made by people whose institutional interests extended beyond the protection function to include the management of the palace's exposure to the specific narrative that the Mannakee-Diana relationship represented. The two readings of the same set of decisions are not mutually exclusive. They are both accurate accounts of the same events, viewed from different vantage points and with different emphases. The official account occupies the first reading exclusively. The complete account occupies both readings simultaneously, and the space in which both readings are held at once is the space in which the most honest account of what happened between 1983 and 1987, in the proximity of the Princess of Wales and her protection detail lives. The intelligence record would tell us which reading is more complete. The intelligence record is classified. The classified record is the specific location of the most significant remaining questions about the Mannakee story. Questions that the public record's available material has not resolved, and that the intelligence world's relationship to public accountability means will not be resolved through the processes of democratic accountability that the question's significance warrants. The questions will age with the classification schedule when, if, the classified material becomes available through the passage of time and the standard operation of the declassification process. It will be available to people who are no longer the people most affected by its content. The family will be older or gone. Diana will have been dead for decades longer than she already has been. Barry Mannakee will have been dead for longer than most people who are alive now will be able to clearly remember. The questions will be answered for the historical record. The historical record will receive them. The people who needed them answered, and who needed them answered in time for the answers to matter to their lives, will have lived out their lives inside the specific uncertainty that the classified record's continued classification has sustained. That is the intelligence dimension of Barry Mannakee's story, not the dramatic revelation of a conspiracy confirmed by the classified record's release. The quiet, sustained, bureaucratically maintained uncertainty of classified information that is not released in time to matter to the people it most matters to. The relationships Diana had with men in the years following Mannakee's removal and death constitute a pattern that the standard accounts of her personal life have examined primarily through the lens of each individual relationship's specific character: the James Hewitt years, the brief connections, the Oliver Hoare entanglement, the Will Carling affair, the final summer with Dodi Fayed. Each of these relationships has been examined on its own terms, with its own narrative, its own accounting of what it represented for Diana and what it revealed about the state of the marriage and the state of Diana's understanding of her own situation. What the standard accounts have not examined, because the examination requires holding all the relationships in view simultaneously and assessing their collective pattern against the specific background of what the Mannakee relationship had meant to Diana and what its loss had cost her, is the specific way in which the Mannakee loss shaped the subsequent relationship's character, the way it established a standard, a contrast, a permanent reference point against which every subsequent relationship was measured, and against which, by her own account from the Paris limousine, every subsequent relationship fell short. The greatest love of her life. The phrase is not simply a declaration of emotional priority, it is a statement about comparison, the claim that, having measured the subsequent relationships against the Mannakee connection, she had found that the measurement produced the Mannakee connection as the superior. The comparison is implicit in the superlative: she had loved others, she had experienced relationships whose significance was sufficient to be worth reporting, she had lived through the Hewitt years, which lasted 5 years, and which she confirmed to 22 million television viewers had been a genuine love. She had experienced whatever the Dodi relationship was becoming in the final summer, and across all of it, the Mannakee connection remained the measurement standard. The standard's persistence across a decade of subsequent relationships tells you something about the Mannakee connection's specific character that the individual relationship's accounts do not capture. It tells you that what Mannakee had provided, the specific quality of being genuinely seen and engaged with on the basis of that seeing, was something that the subsequent relationships had not consistently reproduced, and that its absence from those relationships was the dimension of their inadequacy that made the comparison produce the outcome the Paris footage revealed. James Hewitt is the relationship that comparison with the Mannakee connection illuminates most directly, because the Hewitt relationship is the most completely documented of the post-Mannakee relationships, and because its character has been established in sufficient detail to allow a serious assessment of what it provided and what it did not provide. Hewitt was attentive in the ways that the accounts of the relationship consistently describe: genuinely warm, genuinely responsive to Diana's emotional state, genuinely present in the specific way that makes the person who is present feel received. The relationship lasted 5 years, which is a duration that reflects more than the management of a professional boundary violation or the exploitation of a vulnerable woman's situation. 5 years reflects something genuine, and Diana confirmed the genuineness of what she felt about Hewitt in the Panorama interview. But the Hewitt relationship ended. It ended, in Diana's account, with the experience of abandonment that his deployment to the Gulf produced, the specific quality of going that she experienced as a desertion rather than as a military necessity, the departure that confirmed the limits of the relationship's commitment in ways that the relationship's warmth had not prepared her for. The abandonment experience is itself a contrast with what the Mannakee connection represented in her memory. Mannakee had not abandoned her. He had been removed from her by the institution, against her preference, and presumably against his. Through a process that neither of them had chosen, and that neither of them had the power to contest. His removal was the institution's action rather than his choice. His death was a road accident rather than a retreat from commitment. The loss of him, in both its forms, was not the loss of his willingness to be present, but the loss of his ability to be present. The loss through institutional removal, and then through death, rather than through the relational failure that abandonment represents. The comparison between a loss through institutional removal and death and a loss through abandonment is not symmetrical, and the asymmetry matters for understanding why the Mannakee connection retained the supremacy that the Paris footage revealed across the decade of subsequent relationships. A man who was taken from you by forces outside either of your control occupies a different position in the memory of the loss than a man who chose to leave. The former can be mourned as the ideal that the circumstances prevented from being realized. The latter must be mourned as the ideal that the person's own choices revealed was not what it appeared to be. Mannakee died before the relationship could reveal its limitations. He was removed before the long-term pressures that relationships between people in fundamentally different social positions, a princess and a police officer, would eventually have exposed, could expose them. The relationship that existed was the relationship of the 2 years of the assignment, which was the relationship's formative and presumably its best period, before the sustained pressures of its continuation, under the specific circumstances the continuation would have required, had produced the attrition that sustained pressures always produce. The memory that Diana carried across the decade was therefore the memory of the relationship at its best, the relationship as it had existed in the specific conditions that had produced it, yes, before the conditions that would have tested it had been applied. This is the specific character of losses that occur before the lost thing's limitations have been revealed. They are preserved in the memory as the idealized version of themselves, because the real version was not given the time to develop the ordinary imperfections that reality always produces in the things that begin as ideals. The subsequent relationships were all given that time. Hewitt's limitations became apparent. Hoare's limitations became apparent. The men who came through Diana's life in the years between Mannakee's removal and her own death were all men who had the time to reveal what the sustained pressures of reality produced in them, and what reality produced in each of them was the specific evidence that they were not what the ideal comparison required. The ideal comparison was Barry Mannakee, preserved in the memory at his best, the warm, attentive, genuinely seeing presence that the 2 years of the assignment had produced, against a background of loss that had not allowed the ideal to be tested by the ordinary attrition of sustained relationship in ordinary circumstances. The Oliver Hoare relationship occupies a specific position in this analysis because it is the relationship whose specific character, the obsessive phone calls, the intensity that the accounts of the relationship describe as something beyond the ordinary quality of romantic attachment, reflects most directly the specific quality of unmet need that the Mannakee loss had installed. Hoare was a married man, a friend of the family, an art dealer whose social world overlapped with the palace's without being identical to it. The relationship with him was not the simple expression of romantic feeling, but the expression of something more desperate in its quality, the reaching toward a connection whose desperation reflected the specific character of the absence it was trying to fill. The phone calls, hundreds of them, made to his home at hours that his wife eventually reported to the police as harassment, are the behavior of someone for whom the reaching had become compulsive, in the way that reaching always becomes compulsive when what is being reached for is the specific thing that cannot be found in the available sources, and whose absence has become the defining condition of the daily experience. Dodi Fayed arrived in the summer of 1997, 10 years after Mannakee's death, and the relationship's pace of development, the speed with which Diana moved from initial meeting to the photographs that announced the relationship to the world, reflects the specific quality of someone who was still, a decade later, seeking with urgency what the loss of Mannakee had made unavailable. Whether Dodi was the person who could provide it, or whether the relationship's speed was itself the expression of the urgency rather than the evidence of its satisfaction, is the question that the relationship's 6 weeks did not provide sufficient time to answer. She died before the answer could be produced. The Mannakee connection remained the standard, the greatest love of her life. The relationships that followed him were the relationships of a woman who knew what the standard felt like and who was looking, across the subsequent decade, for the thing she had lost. She did not find it in the terms that the comparison required. The finding would have required the sustained presence of someone who saw her in the way that Mannakee had seen her, across a sustained enough period that the seeing survived the tests of reality, in circumstances that the palace could not remove the person from, and that the road in Hertfordshire could not end. The circumstances were never sufficient. The standard remained. The greatest love remained the love that was lost before the losing could be anything other than the institution's choice and the road's accident, rather than the relationship's own revealed limitations. The specific tragedy of that is the specific tragedy of Diana's private life. Not the tragedy of someone who never loved or was loved, but the tragedy of someone who experienced the ideal and lost it before the ideal could become the ordinary thing that surviving relationships always become, and who spent the decade of the ideal's loss searching for its replacement in circumstances that made the replacement unavailable. The story of Barry Mannakee is, at its most essential, a story about seeing, about the specific, transformative, and apparently rare experience of being seen clearly by another person, of existing in the daily presence of someone who observes you without the institutional filters that most of the people in your world apply to the observation, and who responds to what they observe with the direct, uncomplicated warmth that the unfiltered seeing makes possible. Diana spent her adult life inside an institution specifically designed to prevent this experience. The institution's design was not malicious. It was not constructed with the specific intention of ensuring that the Princess of Wales never encountered genuine human attention. It was constructed to serve the monarchy's constitutional and public functions, and those functions required the management of every relationship between the senior members of the royal family and the people around them through the institutional filters that the function's requirements imposed. The filters were professional, social, hierarchical, and constitutional, and their combined operation produced an environment in which the people closest to Diana were people whose primary relationship to her was shaped by the institutional context before it was shaped by anything personal. Mannakee occupied a different position in this environment, and the difference was produced by the specific character of the close protection role rather than by any particular quality that distinguished him from the other people in Diana's immediate world. The close protection role placed him in daily proximity to her at the level where the institutional filters operated least completely, the transitions between performances, the private moments that the public schedule created and then moved through, the specific register of daily life that exists beneath the managed surface of any person's public existence. In this register, the institutional filters were thinner than they were in the formal occasions that the filters were primarily designed to manage, and the thinning allowed what was underneath the filters to be more directly observable. What was underneath the filters was a 22-year-old woman who was acutely unhappy inside a marriage that was failing from its first years, and inside an institution that was not equipped to support her. The unhappiness was visible to someone observing from the close protection position, and the observation of it in someone of Mannakee's specific character produced the response that the observation produced in him, the warmth, the attentiveness, the specific quality of engaged presence that Diana's accounts of what he provided consistently describe. He saw her. He saw the person behind the performance, the woman inside the princess, the specific human being whose daily experience of the institutional management of her existence was the experience of someone being managed rather than supported, processed rather than seen. The seeing was the most significant thing he offered her, and it was the most significant thing she lost when he was removed. The palace's decision to remove him was not a decision to deprive Diana of the experience of being seen. The palace's decision was a professional management decision about a protection relationship that had exceeded its professional parameters. The decision was correct within its own logic and devastating in its human consequence, and the two things are simultaneously true rather than mutually exclusive. This is the specific double truth that the Mannakee story requires to be held in view without resolving it in either direction. The truth that the palace's management of the situation was professionally appropriate, and the truth that the professionally appropriate management produced the specific human cost that the subsequent decade of Diana's personal life reflects. The double truth does not make the palace culpable for a malicious act. It makes the palace the institution whose correct application of its own professional logic produced consequences that the professional logic was not designed to account for, and whose indifference to those consequences was the expression of the institutional indifference to the human costs of correct institutional procedure that institutions consistently produce. Mannakee died 9 months after the removal, on a road in Hertfordshire, in an accident whose specific circumstances the official investigations have concluded were accidental, and whose specific circumstances the conspiracy theories have concluded were not accidental, and whose specific circumstances the available evidence has not resolved in a manner that provides the specific certainty that the question deserves. The uncertainty is the honest position. The honest position is uncomfortable. The discomfort is the appropriate response to an honest position about an event whose human significance warrants the discomfort that honest uncertainty produces. Diana carried the loss for the decade between his death and her own. She carried it in the private register of a life whose public dimensions were managed toward the specific presentations that the public role required, and she expressed it in the fragmented, indirect forms that private carriage of unacknowledged loss always produces, in the Morton material, in the Paris limousine footage, in the accounts of the people who were near her and who understood, through sustained proximity, what the carrying looked like from the outside. The greatest love of her life. The words landed in a Paris limousine in 1997 with the specific weight of 10 years of private carriage. They landed without the audience that the private carriage had protected the words from reaching. They landed in a filmed conversation that neither party knew was being filmed, which is the specific condition that produces the most reliable expressions of what someone actually thinks, the expression that requires no management because the management is not understood to be necessary. The expression tells you what the decade of private carriage had produced, not the resolution of the loss into manageable memory, not the absorption of the significant into the historical, but the continued living with of something that had not been resolved, and that the 10 years had not diminished to the point where the diminishment changed the measurement. He was still the greatest love of her life in 1997. He had been dead for 10 years. She had loved other people in those 10 years. The comparison still produced the same result. The result tells you about the specific quality of what was lost in the removal and the death. It tells you that the 2 years of the assignment had produced in Diana an experience of connection whose depth the subsequent decade and its relationships had not equaled. It tells you that the experience of being seen clearly and engaged with warmly on the basis of that clear seeing was, for Diana, the rarest and most significant experience available in the specific emotional landscape of her life, and that its provision by Mannakee and its loss through the removal and the death constituted a loss of sufficient depth that a decade of subsequent relationships could not produce its equivalent. The palace removed him because the professional relationship had exceeded its parameters. The palace was right that the parameters had been exceeded. The palace was indifferent to the cost of the removal in the specific life of the person from whom the thing that exceeded the parameters was removed. The indifference was institutional rather than personal. No individual in the palace made a specific decision to disregard Diana's experience of the removal. The institutional logic simply did not include her experience as a consideration relevant to the professional management decision. Barry Mannakee's story is therefore, at its most complete, the story of what happens when the institutional logic of a correctly functioning professional protection apparatus encounters the human reality of a person whose emotional needs the institutional world is not designed to meet, and when the encounter produces the specific event that the institutional logic addresses correctly and the human reality experiences as loss. The institutional logic operated correctly. The human reality experienced a loss that the subsequent decade confirmed was genuinely significant. The two things are both true, and the truth of both of them is the specific uncomfortable truth that the Mannakee story requires the people who engage with it to hold without resolving into the clean narrative that either the official version or the conspiracy theories would produce. He was a police officer from Essex who walked 3 paces behind a princess for 2 years, and in those 2 years saw her clearly enough, and responded to what he saw warmly enough, to produce in her the experience she would carry for the remaining 12 years of her life, as the standard against which every subsequent experience of love was measured and found insufficient. He was killed on a road in Hertfordshire 9 months after the palace removed him from her daily life. She died on a road in Paris 10 years after his death on the road in Hertfordshire, having described him in a private conversation in a Paris limousine 2 months before her own death as probably the greatest love of her life. The probably is the honest qualification. She was not certain which category the experience belonged to. She was certain that the experience, whatever its category, was the experience that mattered most among the experiences she had had of that category. The experience was 2 years of being seen clearly by a police officer from Essex who walked 3 paces behind her through the managed performances of her public life, and who saw what the 3 paces and the daily proximity and his own specific quality of warmth allowed him to see. The seeing was the beginning of the story. His death was not its end. She carried it for 10 more years. The carrying ended on a road in Paris. The story has been carried by the people who tell it since. It has not been resolved. Some stories do not resolve. This is one of them. Stephen Puddick was riding the motorcycle. This is the one biographical fact about him that the public record of the Mannakee story establishes with certainty. He was the officer who was operating the vehicle when the collision with Nicola Chop's car occurred on the A414 on the evening of the 11th of May 1987, and he survived the collision that killed the man who was riding pillion behind him. Everything else about Stephen Puddick, his relationship to Mannakee before the accident, his knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the removal, his experience of surviving the collision and its aftermath, and the specific quality of what he has carried across the nearly 4 decades since that evening, is information that the public record contains in fragments, rather than in the complete account that his position as the only living person who was physically present at the moment of Mannakee's death makes him uniquely positioned to provide. He was a Metropolitan Police officer, which places him inside the professional culture of discretion and institutional loyalty that the police institution installs in its members as thoroughly as the palace installs its own version of the same culture in the people who serve within it. A police officer who survives an accident in which a colleague dies has specific professional obligations in the aftermath: the obligation to cooperate with the investigation into the accident, the obligation to provide accurate testimony to the inquest, and the ongoing obligation to the institution's culture of discretion about the professional context in which the accident occurred. Puddick fulfilled these obligations. He testified at the inquest. He cooperated with the accident investigation. He provided the account that the official processes required of him, within the terms that those processes established. The account he provided was the account of an accident, a motorcycle, a car, an intersection, and a collision whose circumstances were consistent with the road accident that the official conclusion recorded. What the official processes did not require of him, and what he has not provided in any forum that has produced a public record, is the account that extends beyond the official processes requirements, the account of the context in which the accident occurred, the account of what he knew about Mannakee's removal from Diana's protection detail and the circumstances surrounding the removal, and the account of what, if anything, had been unusual about the period between the removal and the death in terms of Mannakee's state of mind, his circumstances, or anything that might have been relevant to an understanding of the events of that evening beyond the mechanics of the collision. The conspiracy theories have been interested in Puddick in the specific way that they are interested in everyone who was physically proximate to the events they theorize about, interested in the possibility that his account, if fully disclosed, would contain material that the official version does not contain, and that would support the conspiracy theory's alternative account of what happened. The conspiracy theorists have produced various versions of what Puddick's hypothetical full account might contain, ranging from the suggestion that the motorcycle was interfered with in ways that the accident investigation did not detect, to the suggestion that Puddick himself was involved in the events in ways that the official record has not established. These suggestions are not supported by evidence of the kind that confident assertion requires. They are the speculative elaborations of conspiracy theories that work by populating the gaps in the official record with the specific content that the theory requires. And the gaps in the official record around Stephen Puddick are gaps that the conspiracy theories have populated with material that the evidence does not confirm or deny, because the evidence that would confirm or deny it has not been produced. The evidence that would be most relevant is Puddick's own full account, given freely and without the constraints that the institutional loyalties of a career police officer impose on the statements its members make about events occurring in the course of their professional duties. This account has not been given. He has not sought the public platform. He has not cooperated with journalists or documentary makers whose interest in his specific position as the sole surviving witness to Mannakee's death has been expressed over the decades in approaches that his public silence suggests he has consistently declined. The decline is his right. The decline is the natural response of someone who understands that engaging publicly with the Mannakee story requires engaging with the conspiracy theories that the story's public dimension is entangled with, and that engaging with those conspiracy theories places him in a position where anything he says will be interpreted through the theory's framework, rather than received as the testimony of a witness who is simply reporting what he experienced. If he confirms the accident's accidental character, the conspiracy theorists will interpret the confirmation as the statement of someone who has been instructed to provide it, or who has reasons for providing it, that are incompatible with his providing a genuinely honest account. If he produces anything that complicates the accident's accidental character, the complication will be seized upon as confirmation of what the conspiracy theories have been claiming. Either outcome, in the specific information environment that the Diana conspiracy theories have created around every aspect of the events surrounding her life and death, fails to produce the outcome that honest testimony should produce, which is the outcome of being received on its own terms and assessed against its own evidential value. This is the specific trap that the conspiracy theory environment creates for people who are in a position to provide testimony relevant to the events the theories address. The testimony is not received neutrally, it is received through the theory's framework, which predetermines what the testimony means, regardless of its specific content. A person who understands this, who has watched, across nearly 4 decades, the way that everyone connected to the Mannakee story has been processed by the theory's framework, has rational grounds for concluding that producing testimony in the public forum is an act whose costs are not proportionate to its benefits. Puddick appears to have concluded exactly this. His silence across 4 decades is the silence of someone who has made a specific calculation about the costs and benefits of public engagement with a story in which his position places him at the most exposed available point, the only living person who was physically present when Barry Mannakee died, in the story that has made Barry Mannakee the subject of the most sustained conspiracy theorizing in the history of the Diana industry. The calculation is rational, and the silence it has produced is the silence that the rational calculation produces. It is also, for the people who have a genuine interest in understanding what happened on the A414 on the evening of the 11th of May 1987, a silence that forecloses the most direct available route to the understanding they are seeking. What Puddick saw and experienced that evening, not the theorized version of a staged accident, but the actual experience of a collision on a wet road that killed the man who was riding pillion, is information that the official record has received in the specific form that the official processes required, and that the complete human account of a traumatic event always exceeds. The official record contains the testimony that the inquest required. It does not contain the full texture of the experience, the specific quality of what it was to be riding the motorcycle in the moments before the collision, the sensory details of the collision itself, the immediate aftermath in which one man was injured and another was dead, and the specific quality of the subsequent life of someone who has been carrying that experience across the 4 decades since the evening it occurred. The carrying of the experience of surviving an accident that kills your colleague, the specific psychological burden of survival when the person who did not survive is someone you knew professionally and humanly, is a burden whose weight the public account of the Mannakee story has not attended to with any sustained seriousness. The public account is interested in the dead man and in the woman who loved him. It is not interested in the surviving man whose experience of the evening has been shaped by everything that has happened since, including the specific character of the public story that the evening produced. Puddick has been living for nearly 4 decades in the specific position of someone who was there, who saw what happened, who survived what happened, and who has been unable to separate the private reality of his own experience of the event from the public narrative that the event's connection to the Diana story has produced around it. The private reality and the public narrative are not necessarily the same thing. In most events that become public stories, the people who were present for the events find that the public narrative is a simplified or distorted version of the private reality that the narrative's simplification and distortion has made familiar while making it less accurate. In Puddick's case, the specific distortion that the conspiracy theories have introduced into the public narrative around the events of that evening is a distortion of a specific character, the distortion that transforms an accident into an assassination, a road collision into a planned operation, and the survivor of the collision into either an innocent bystander who has been protected by institutional silence, or a participant in the events whose silence is itself part of the operation the theories describe. Neither characterization of Puddick, neither the innocent bystander nor the participant, is established by the available evidence. The available evidence establishes that he was riding the motorcycle, that the collision occurred, that he was injured and his passenger died, and that he has maintained a public silence about the events and their context across the nearly 4 decades since they occurred. The public silence is the fact. The specific meaning of the public silence, what it reflects about what he knows, what he has concluded, and what he has decided the public forum is, and is not the appropriate venue for, is not accessible from the public record because the public record contains only the fact of the silence, rather than the content of the knowledge the silence protects, or the reasoning that produced the decision to maintain it. He was there. He survived. He has not spoken beyond the requirements of the official processes. He is the most direct available link to the physical reality of the evening that ended Barry Mannakee's life. The link is maintained in silence. The silence will end when he chooses to end it, or when it ends permanently at his death. The choice is his, as it is always the choice of the person who carries knowledge of significant events, whether to produce that knowledge in the public forum or to hold it in the private register, where it will eventually pass from the world with the person who holds it. The Mannakee story has been told primarily by the people who were not there. The person who was there has not told it. The difference between those two versions of the story, the version that has been told and the version that has not, is the difference between the public account of the 11th of May 1987 and the complete account, and the complete account lives only with Stephen Puddick. It has been living with him for nearly 4 decades. Where it goes next is his decision. The footage was shot in the summer of 1997 by a documentary film crew that had been given access to Diana in the months before her death for a project about her life and work. The access was managed, as all access to Diana was managed during this period, within specific parameters. There were subjects the filming would address, and subjects it would not, occasions where the camera would be present, and occasions where it would not, and an understanding on both sides of the arrangement about the general character of the material that the access was intended to produce. The limousine was not one of the occasions where the camera was supposed to be present. The filming of the conversation between Diana and her hairdresser Natalie Simons in the back of the car on the way to the French film premiere was not a staged production moment. The camera that captured it was capturing what the camera captures when it is running without the subject's specific awareness that it is running, the unmanaged version of events, the version produced when the people in front of the lens are not performing for the lens because they do not know the lens is there. The specific quality of candor that unaware filming produces is different from the candor that people produce when they know they are being filmed and choose to be frank. Chosen candor is still a performance. It is the performance of candor, which is different from the thing itself in the specific way that all performed versions of genuine things differ from the genuine things they perform. Unaware candor is the genuine thing, expressed without the management that awareness of observation always introduces into expression. Diana's lips moved. The words were not audible on the footage's audio track, with the clarity required to establish their content. The footage was eventually reviewed, years after Diana's death, by people working on documentary projects about her life, whose interest in the footage's content led them to engage a specialist to examine what her lips were saying. Lip reading is a discipline whose specific limitations deserve acknowledgement before its specific contribution to the Mannakee story is assessed. A skilled lip reader, working from clear footage of a subject's full face, speaking English in normal conversational conditions, can establish the content of speech with a reliability that goes well beyond guesswork, but that falls short of the absolute certainty that audio recording provides. The reliability varies with the quality of the footage, the visibility of the speaker's lips, the distance from the camera, and the specific characteristics of the speaker's articulatory patterns. The footage of the limousine conversation was reviewed by lip readers whose specific qualifications and the specific conditions of the footage they were working from have been described in the accounts of the documentary projects that commissioned the review. The conditions were imperfect, the footage was not close up, the camera angle was not ideal, and the lighting conditions of the back of a moving limousine do not produce the ideal conditions for lip-reading accuracy. The lip reader's conclusions were therefore offered as best interpretations of the available footage, rather than as transcriptions, with the certainty that ideal conditions would have provided. The best interpretation, the reading that the lip readers produced of what Diana was saying in the section of footage that has been most discussed in the subsequent public conversation about the limousine recording, was the reading that placed into the public record the specific words that have been attributed to her in every account of this footage since. Her description of Mannakee as probably the greatest love of her life. The probably is the word that most clearly reflects the condition of the reading. It is either a word that Diana said, the specific word that qualified her own assessment of the relationship's significance, the honest acknowledgement of the uncertainty that any comparison of deep feelings requires, or it is an artifact of the lip reading's imperfect conditions, the best interpretation of lip movements that might have been producing a different word in the original. The distinction matters because the probably is the word that does the most significant work in the sentence, the word that makes the statement a genuine reflection of Diana's own uncertainty rather than a confident declaration of hierarchy. If the probably was Diana's word, and the lip reader's interpretation suggests it was the word of someone who was thinking as she spoke, rather than producing a prepared statement, who was genuinely engaging with the question of comparative significance, rather than asserting a conclusion she had already reached with certainty. The probably makes the statement more rather than less credible, as an authentic account of Diana's actual thinking, because the authentic thinking of someone genuinely reflecting on complex emotional experience is the thinking that produces qualifications, rather than certainties. The footage's subsequent history is the history of how private material becomes public record in the specific conditions of the Diana Industries operation. The documentary project that had produced the footage was not initially in public circulation. The footage existed in the archive of the production company that had shot it, and its relevance to the Mannakee story was not publicly known until the footage was reviewed and the lip reading was commissioned. The commissioning produced the reading. The reading was incorporated into documentary material that reached broadcast. The broadcast reached an audience that processed it as one of the significant confirmations of what Diana had felt about Mannakee. The confirmation was significant because it was produced by Diana's own lips, rather than by the second-hand accounts of people who claimed to have been told by Diana what she felt. The second-hand accounts had been available for years. The Morton material, the accounts of people close to Diana who had received her confidences about Mannakee, the gradually accumulating record of what people who had been near her reported her to have said about him. These accounts were all filtered through the specific limitations of second-hand testimony, the limitations of memory, of the specific character of the relationship between the account's source and Diana, and of the interests that the source might have had in presenting Diana's feelings in particular ways. The lip reading produced something that the second-hand accounts could not produce, a direct connection between a visual record of Diana's physical presence and the words she was saying, without the intervening layer of another person's recall and reporting. The directness of the connection gave the footage a specific evidential character that the second-hand accounts did not have. and the evidential character was received accordingly, as the closest available confirmation of what Diana actually thought, produced in the conditions that unaware filming creates. The conditions that unaware filming creates are conditions that raise their own questions about the relationship between footage and truth. The footage is real. Diana was there, in that limousine, speaking those words, or words close enough to those words, that the lip readers produced that reading. But the footage is also a fragment, a few seconds of a longer conversation, extracted from its context, read by specialists working from imperfect conditions, and assigned significance in the broader narrative of Diana's inner life on the basis of what the fragment's interpreted content appears to reveal. The context of the conversation matters for assessing the fragment's significance. What was Natalie Simons saying that produced this response? Was Diana being asked a direct question about Mannakee, or was the conversation producing a spontaneous reflection that the question of greatest loves emerged from without being specifically solicited? Was Diana in a state of particular emotional openness? Was she tired, or had the conversation been taking a direction that had produced the specific candor that the statement reflects? Or was she in the ordinary state of someone making conversation on the way to a public event? These contextual questions are not answerable from the fragment. The fragment is the evidence, and the fragment is all that is available. The contextual questions remain questions in the way that all contextual questions remain questions when the only record of an event is a fragment rather than the complete account. The fragment has done significant work in the public conversation about Mannakee. It has been used as the primary evidential anchor for the claim that Diana's feelings for Mannakee were genuinely of the magnitude and the lasting significance that the conspiracy theories require them to be. The magnitude that makes the conspiracy theorists claim that his death was arranged by people who understood that significance, coherent rather than disproportionate. If Diana's feelings for Mannakee were modest or brief or professional in their primary character, the motivation for the palace to arrange his death is less coherent than if her feelings were the most significant she experienced in her adult life. The lip reading's conclusion therefore does double duty in the Mannakee narrative. It confirms the emotional significance of the relationship, and it provides the motivational coherence that the conspiracy theories require to sustain their claim about the death. This double utility has meant that the lip reading's conclusion has been embraced with particular enthusiasm by the conspiracy theory community, and the embrace has shaped the conditions in which the conclusion has been received more broadly. The conditions shaped by the conspiracy theory community's embrace are not the conditions that produce the most careful assessment of the conclusion's reliability. They are the conditions that produce the most interested reception of the conclusion's implications, and the interested reception is not the same thing as the careful assessment. The careful assessment is the one that holds simultaneously the lip reading's positive evidence, Diana's lips moving in ways consistent with those words, in conditions where unmanaged speech is the most reliable available source, and the lip reading's limitations, the imperfect footage, the angles, the probably's ambiguity, the absence of the contextual information that would allow the fragment to be fully understood. The careful assessment produces a conclusion of significant weight without the certainty that the conspiracy theory's use of the footage has often implied. The conclusion of significant weight is sufficient for the purposes of understanding Diana's inner life. It is sufficient to establish that the Mannakee connection was a connection of genuine and lasting significance to her. It is sufficient to establish that the connection's significance persisted across the decade between his death and her own in a way that the official characterization of a professional boundary violation does not accommodate. It is sufficient to establish, in the clearest available direct form, that Diana's own assessment of her own experience placed the Mannakee connection at the top of the comparative hierarchy she applied to the significant experiences of her adult emotional life. The limousine was moving. The camera was running. Diana did not know. She said what she thought, in the unmanaged register that unaware filming captures. The lip reader read the unmanaged words. The words entered the permanent record. They will not leave it. Barry Mannakee has been in Diana's permanent record since the summer of 1997. spoken in a Paris limousine on the way to a film premiere, 2 months before she died on a Paris road. The speaking was private. The record is permanent. The gap between those two facts is the gap that defines the specific character of the limousine footage's place in his story. Private expression, caught by the specific accident of a camera's operation, made public by the specific circumstances of the footage's subsequent history, and now part of the record that will outlast the people who made it and the people who received it. He was probably the greatest love of her life. The probably is hers. The permanence is the record's. The man it refers to died on a road in Hertfordshire in May 1987. The footage that confirmed what he had meant to her was produced in a limousine in Paris in the summer of 1997. The two roads are 37 miles and 10 years apart. The distance between them is the distance of the story that this account has attempted to tell. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.